Oh, shoot. Shoot.
We can't hear you, FYI.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. Thank you. Apologize for the mistake earlier. So good afternoon and good morning. Welcome and thank you for joining us for an Alliant International University Fresno and a Box Hill Institute as we present international conversations about diversity, inclusivity, and advocacy. This two-day virtual symposium will highlight issues for marginalized populations, the LGBTQ community, to affirm practices and create deeper appreciation for Indigenous people and culture of Australia. Day one will emphasize the conversations for the LGBTQIA community. Day two will create a deeper understanding and appreciation for Australian Indigenous cultures. So before we continue, I'd like to quickly go over some housekeeping rules. Please make sure your microphone remains muted and your cameras are turned off. This will help ensure the primary focus of our panelists and their message. If you have any questions, please ask them in the chat during the Q&A section. Stephanie and I will direct these questions to the panelists. No rude or disrespectful or hate-filled comments will be tolerated. We are creating a safe space to ask questions and learn. If any disrespectful or racist comments are made in the chat, you will be removed from the symposium without warning. If at any time this symposium you feel you need extra support, we have a list of resources both in Australia and the US where you can reach out in a medium most comfortable to you. So a quick introduction. My name is Saivan Ajong, a PhD student in clinical psychology program at the California School of Professional Psychology at Alliant International University of Fresno. And I'll be your co-host along with Stephanie Cunningham and Zane Sandoval. So I would like to give a quick overview of how our idea came together. Over the past year and a half, Stephanie and I have been discussing how we can have an exchange of ideas and immersion of understanding of underserved and marginalized diverse communities. But because of COVID, there was a change in plans. Stephanie thought we should have a symposium to highlight issues as well as create conversations for the LGBTQIA and Indigenous cultures. And here we are today. Again, welcome and thank you for joining us for today. As I mentioned previously, Day One Symposium, which is reflecting advances in LGBTQIA plus communities, advocacy, education, and research. I would also like to introduce Stephanie Cunningham, my event co-coordinator.
Good morning and good afternoon. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land.
I can hear her.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting virtually today. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people for the land where I live and meet with you. I pay my respects.
We still can't hear you, Stephanie.
I can hear her.
Say I can hear her.
Is everybody able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Apologies.
Yes.
I do pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I acknowledge and thank them as the world's oldest Indigenous culture for their shared gifts of dreaming, earth, and nature. I would like to extend this thanks to any Indigenous people of other communities who may be here with us today. And I encourage, if you don't know the traditional owners of the lands on which you are residing, to do some research and find out who the traditional owners are. As Zay had mentioned, my name is Stephanie Cunningham. I'm an associate lecturer for the Bachelor's of Community Services at Box Hill Institute, and I'm very excited to be here co-hosting the event today.
So day one is reflecting on advances in LGBTQIA plus advocacy, education, and research. We're here to share ideas on how to create, connections, awareness, understanding, inclusion, and advocacy. Each panelist presenting today will discuss their work with and as a part of the LGBTQIA community to help provide a better perspective of how to create safe space, affirmative practices, and advocacy for the community. First, I'd like to introduce to you Zane Sandoval, and they will share their story.
Hi, first I'd like to say what an honor it is to have been invited to share my story with you all. And thank you, Stephanie, for the reminder to acknowledge the native land from where I'm speaking from. So it's Yokut territory. And a little bit about myself. I'm non-binary and my pronouns are they, them. I'm a recent graduate of the Master's in Clinical Counseling program at Alliant. And by recent, I mean, I got the email this morning that I've graduated. And a little bit about my journey. Honestly, it all started with COVID and stay-at-home orders, kind of being forced to be alone and self-reflect really brought all of the questions of my gender identity to the forefront. Yeah, it was a lot of just being alone to self-reflect and realizing that there were questions that I was trying to avoid. And then when all the distractions went away, those questions kind of came to the forefront. When I hear my birth name, I don't think of it as my dead name. I think of it as someone who I was before. So I'm also one of the presenters for our last presentation for today. And we'll be doing a recording, so you'll actually hear my birth name. And my colleague offered to edit it out, but I felt that it was an important part of my journey. So it doesn't have that same effect as it might have with others that are transgender and non-binary or two-spirit or any sort of other gender identity. But yeah, I'm really excited to be a part of this event today and introduce the rest of our presenters. So Sai, back to you. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. First, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, which will be Tiki Inacay, a psychologist in training attending Alliant International University's doctoral program in the pursuit of clinical psychology, PhD in Fresno, California. They identify as Filipinx non-binary person. Their pronouns are they and them. Currently, they are researching the intersectionality of Filipinx and non-binary identity. Their work was recognized at the Asian American Psychological Association conference in 2019. Go ahead, Tiki.
Thank you for the introduction, Sai. And so with that, I would like to say that today I'm going to be bringing to you a human conversation. Most of my work with the LGBTQIA community is to create advocacy and education and opportunity for awareness. And so most of the things I do are very engaging. So today, in the same spirit of how I do things, we will do that today. So let me start by sharing my screen. So today I would like you to just breathe and know that we're going to share a space for a human conversation. Today we will go over guidelines for what this workshop will entail. We'll talk about the language of human dignity, and we'll have an activity for that. I will share my personal story. Then I'll talk about the language of inclusion and share a short video. For now, the guidelines for this space will be for you to be curious and ask questions. Don't be afraid. Be honest and listen. Be respectful and open-minded. Create space for those that seem that they need space to talk. And then take space when you also need talking, like you need to share something that's burning in your soul. Be mindful of confidentiality and lean into discomfort. Know when to ask for help and make sure to check in if you need to. The first activity we're going to do is called Sticks and Stones. This was created by Jessica Pettit, an amazing speaker who wrote a book called Good Enough for Now on diversity and inclusion. With her permission, I've modified this activity for Zoom. What we're going to be doing is you'll be going into breakout sessions. There will be 8 categories. You will be assigned an identity of a group. When you go into your groups, you're going to write down any messages you've heard or learned growing up or that you see. These could be stereotypes, careers, slang, famous people, media, language, and it's going to be different for each group, for everyone. Don't try to be polite. At this point, you can share the good, bad, and the ugly in your groups. You'll need to choose one person to type things in your chat for your particular breakout session. Remember, those don't have to be things that you believe. They're just things that you know are out there. The groups will be as follows. 1 will be lesbian, 2 will be gay, 3 will be bisexual, 4 transgender, 5 queer, 6 intersex, 7 asexual, and 8 would be the plus. When you go into your groups, these will be the words that you'll be assigned. And I'll go ahead and make sure that that will also be posted in the chat. And this way you'll know for your breakout room, you'll know which one it is. So 1 lesbian, 2 gay, 3 bisexual, 4 transgender, 5 queer, 6 intersex, 7 asexual, and 8 would be and plus. It's important to remember that you will not be held personally accountable for anything that you write. You'll be writing this with your group, so you'll be working on it together. It's not your fault or our fault that these messages are in our heads or that they even exist, but it is our responsibility to learn from these messages. You'll have 2 minutes with your group to write down as much as you can. Make sure you choose one person to do the writing, to type it all in the chat. And then once you have all your words and all your thoughts in your chat for your particular breakout session, remember one takeaway. So one thing that stood out to you as a group, and then be willing to share that in the main room when we come back to see each other. Given that, I am now ready for you all to go into your breakout rooms, and I'll stop sharing. And then I believe that our coordinators will go ahead and get you set up. So if you could kindly put everyone in their breakout rooms and have fun. Hi everyone. So I know that we had some technical difficulties in the beginning for that. So I'm wondering, how did everyone do with their breakout session? Were you able to talk about the different identities? Just kind of give me a wave or a heads up or let me know. Yeah? Okay, good. So then the first room, so this is where we're going to kind of share in the chat. The first room was lesbian. So from the group that talked about lesbians and that identity, what was your takeaway? So if you could just post in the chat one takeaway from your discussion for the lesbian identity. So anyone that's in group 1. Okay. Short hair equals lesbian. Okay, that's one. All right. So then, okay, let's talk about that. Let me ask you the question. Does every lesbian have short hair? So you see heads shaking. No, not every lesbian has short hair. No, no, that's an assumption. There are lesbians in the world with beautiful long hair, right? So there's an assumption there and a bias that lesbians are stereotyped that they all have to look masculine and butch, and that's just not the case. There's lots of beautiful lesbians with rocking beautiful long hair. Okay? So this is how we look at like stereotypes, how we can make these assumptions that are not really true and they don't apply to everyone. All right, so from the group for lesbian gay, group 2, gay, what was your takeaway? If you could just type it in the chat for everyone. Pioneers for change, abomination, the F word, happy, substance abuse, the gay best friend, open-minded. Okay. All right. So that is true, right? There's or not necessarily true. These are the assumptions that are out there that they're pioneers for change, which lots of gay people will do work in the community and they have done things for change, and then a lot of gay people don't. So there's that saying that, proud and loud and over it. There are some gay people that they do not engage in volunteerism and advocacy because it's just not their thing, right? So it's not everyone, right? Abomination. Okay, so that's another really kind of a really harsh bias against gay people. The F word, that could be so hurtful, saying things about gay people that way. Happy. Not all gay people are always happy, but the word gay has a connotation of happy. And substance abuse. And then again, not everyone that is in the community is on substances. The gay best friend and open minded. So you can see that when we look at
The internet working.
assumptions, right? That some of these assumptions could be harmful because there are some gay people that they don't want to be your best friend. Okay. It's just like they're not interested in being your best friend. And every person is different. Every human being has their own way of rocking their identity and being who they are and being free to be who they are. And we can't box them into assumptions of what we think the stereotypes are. Okay? And then the third group as bisexual, lesbian, gay, bisexual. Yeah. So that was my room. And our conversation was that it's just life. And I thought that was an interesting way to approach bisexuality. I think, and as someone that also identifies as bisexual, I'm attracted to both genders and to and it's not like equal or something. It's just I am. And that happens to just be how my life is, how I experience it. But not everybody feels the same way, right? But people will make assumptions about bisexual people that and base who we're with on how we identify, and that's simply just not true. I identify how I identify no matter who I'm with. Okay? Lesbian, gay, bisexual. And then transgender is the fourth group. Anything that came out from the transgender group? In the discussion, if you could post it in the chat. Okay. Confused, dangerous, lively. Okay, so yeah, there's the assumption that transgender people are confused. People that are transgender identifying, they go through something called gender dysphoria, and it's where their identity, their gender identity doesn't particularly match the body that they were born with. And so this is what they're experiencing. It's not necessarily confusion. I would say they just really know who they are. It doesn't match what the body they were born with were assigned at birth, or it doesn't match the gendered norms of society. However, most of the time it's not about confusion. They have this really true honest knowing of who they are, but we can't like attribute that that's confusion. It's literally they have a different knowing of who they are. Okay, and not all trans people are dangerous. um, I would say, and lively. I would say, are all trans people lively? I know some very very shy trans people as well. Rebellious, drag queen, vivacious, non-conforming. So, and not everybody that's transgender is a drag queen. Okay, beautiful, sex workers, abnormal, corruptive, right? So, and then we have to question this, like, their sex work does happen, and I think that's with any marginalized population where they're trying to survive, they're going through oppression. Abnormal, corruptive, those things can be very harmful, these assumptions of trans people. And yet we can't help that these things exist in the world, so we just have to be aware of them and then think of how can we support our trans people, right? So the next room, trans, LGBT, is queer. So for the queer group, what did you say for the queer group, if you can? So queer, confused, or they don't know what they are. You know, I have met people that identify as queer, and you know, I wouldn't say that they're confused or that they don't know who they are. They just identify as queer. Okay? Then these were only what we have heard, not necessarily. Yes, it's only what we've heard out in the world, right? What we've heard and what we've experienced, and this is to just bring light to those conversations. So yes, we don't hold you accountable for that. You can't help that those things exist in the world. This is just for conversation. And then the next group is intersex. The group that talked about intersex. What did you say? Oh, what was the correct terminology for intersex? To use intersex? You know, this is a great question, Sai, and I would say that intersex, I don't identify as intersex. We would have to ask the person that is intersex identifying what would be appropriate for them. And I would say that in dealing with people and working with people and identities, it's important to know how are they identifying, right? And to just simply ask them without being offensive, right? To also be respectful and mindful of them as people. Okay? And then asexual is the next group. What was said about asexual people? Either invisible, missing from representation, or defective, dysfunctional. Yeah, so, you know, asexual people, there is definitely a lack of visibility for asexual people. Okay. And then the next one would be the plus. For the group that was plus, our group has some challenges. We did not know what defined the plus represented. We had to Google to find out, and one member of our group educated us on what pansexual or polyamorous was. Yes. So when we look at all these letters and the plus is just to kind of show that there are more identities in the world, right? There's more identities. And the truth is that each of these letters are, I think, human beings, we give people identities, and we also take them on to structure and to organize and to feel comfortable, right? But the truth is each of these identities are combined with people. They're comprised of people, and each of those people, each of those individuals have stories. and their stories are between all those letters. And I certainly believe that the story is just the human story. Every person has needs, has fears, has dreams, has desires, has thoughts. And at the end of the day, it's we just all are really human. But these words have so much power and they exist in the world, and that can cause oppression and depression and sadness for people. And so it's recognizing that how do we ally with people and recognize that these things exist and it can cause so much pain for human beings. Okay? And that concludes our activity. So now I'll go on to the rest of the presentation and I'll share my screen. And thank you for being so bold and courageous and kind with one another to have this conversation. Okay. So now that we've finished that, I'm going to share my story. Let's get into presenter view. So I identify as non-binary, and for as long as I can remember, I was born and assigned female at birth, but from a very young age, I did not experience my gender as female completely. So that's the interesting thing. I knew I was female. I was okay with that. What I wasn't okay with was that I also identified as male. And I knew this in my heart, and for up until I hit puberty growing up, I was born in the United States and I grew up in the Philippines. And while I was there, my family just sort of let me do what I wanted. So up until I hit puberty, I dressed like a little boy for as long as I could remember. I just thought that my family understood that I identified as both genders. I didn't realize that people didn't know what was happening to me. And I didn't figure it out till one day. Um, we would have parties in the Philippines, and my my grandparents would put me in a room when we would have get-togethers, and someone went up to my grandmother and said, "Hey, your grandson is super cute." And she said, "Well, that's my granddaughter. She's retarded." So that was sort of like this kind of like what is my grandma talking about? And that's how they dealt with my gender. They sort of just allowed me to be, but they didn't really acknowledge my gender. And so I felt very invisible and very alone in who I was. By the time I grew up, I would say I came out as bisexual in my 20s or late 20s. And then in my 30s, I started going through depression and feeling like I had to constantly conform to female identity when I didn't always experience myself that way. And if you look at this picture here, the man right here in the photo by Edgar Marino, that's me in drag. So you see me with my beard, just sitting there on the couch, and I experience myself this way whether I see this in the mirror every day or not. But I also experience myself as feminine. So I'm bigender. I identify as both genders, and sometimes I will feel more female for like a couple days, a couple weeks, a couple months, and then it will shift and I might feel more masculine and more male. And there's times where I'm just in between. So I identify as non-binary, and my gender is not predicted by what I'm wearing or by people's assumptions. I just am who I am. But as I grew older, I came out as non-binary and transgender. The way I came out, I had been depressed for a very, very long time, and I was suicidal. And one day I'd come to the realization that I truly was transgender. And it was so hard to face. And I remember being on a bridge and it was raining, and I was just so tired of feeling like I couldn't be who I was, or that I had to constantly explain, or that people didn't know who I really was. They didn't see me. And so and this is something I was very ashamed of. I took my steering wheel and it was raining. I was on this bridge, and I just grabbed the wheel and I went as far as I could, and I just closed my eyes and I just said, I can't do this anymore. And while I was spinning in the rain on this bridge, thinking this is it, my life is over, I'm gonna die, and somehow my car, I could see other headlights coming toward me, and somehow my car just kind of spun out of control and veered to the right, and there I was at the end of this bridge, and I was crying, and I thought, how could my gender be so messed up? How could I be so wrong? How could I be so different? And then I realized I was still alive. Because my car had just spun out of control in the rain. I was on the edge of this bridge, and then some part of me just said, you know what, I need to oh, my slideshow is just changing on me. I need to just be honest about who I am, and I need to recognize that this is me, and I'm gonna be okay, and it's time for me to come out as me. And so I did. And I would say that was in 2010. And I've been out as transgender and non-binary for the last 11 years, and it's been a journey. It's been a journey of talking about my pronouns as they and them, coming out to my family. It's not been easy, but I would say that that was the turning point for me. And I realized at that moment that there's lots of people out there that they want to live free, and they want to live and be authentic, and I was going to be a part of that. I wanted to make sure that I did research and dedicated my life to any kind of changes I possibly could to support people so that they don't have to be at the end of a bridge. With that, and I said I wouldn't cry, but this is a picture from the Philippines, and it's the world's record of the human rainbow. And it was set by the Polytech University in the Philippines. There's 30,365 people. They formed this rainbow in the Philippines. It's the Guinness Book of World Record. And I would say, it was this was challenged. In fact, it was challenged by Australia. But because of COVID, Australia could not organize to challenge our record. So all I can say is this, to top my story off, is I am so proud that this happened in the Philippines, and being Filipinx, and Australia, bring it, okay? All the Australians in the audience, have your human rainbow, break our record, 30,365 participants. But I would say the language of inclusion, and we've gone through this activity, is a global movement all over the world. And love wins, okay? This is a hopeful conversation, okay? It's difficult to go through the coming out process. It is hard. My journey has been a story with lots of pain, but it's also had lots of joy. And love wins. And when we think about affirming language, the words are going to be positive, supportive, accepting. Change, because change has to happen. It's a part of conversations and visibility, being seen and having access to healthcare and to spaces like the dominant society does. In fact, globally, there is a day called Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia. It's also been called the Day Against Phobia. It's on May 17th every year. And the United Nations made this statement: to young LGBTQIA plus people everywhere, let me say, you are not alone. You are worthy, you are loved and valued for who you are. The United Nations will continue to stand with you and advocate for the respect and protection of your rights and dignity. And I would tell you this: yes, you are loved. You are not alone, and you are valued, and you are worthy. So I want to end my conversation with this video, and this is happening. It's called the Pink Dot Movement in Singapore, but this conversation is a global one, and there is hope. And yes, love wins. Thank you, and I'll end with this video.
10 years ago, it was a very small, very humble dot. It was like friends and family, and now it's like neighbors and community.
I've been coming to Pink Dot since it started, and I think this year we are ready to say that Pink Dot is for everyone.
We are ready to be accepted by society as a whole.
And to also accept ourselves.
Yeah. We are ready
for change, yes.
Yeah. We are ready. We are a voice that needs to be heard.
I am ready.
We are ready. We are ready.
I just want to live in a society that's inclusive. Now that I have children, I want to expose them to what society should look like. Multi everything.
Tonight, we will be making 10 declarations on the changes that we are ready for. Number 1, we are ready to step our friends and family members who are LGBT so that none of them will ever feel the need to hide who they are. Number 2, we are ready to start difficult conversations, even with people who don't agree with the values that we stand for. We need to keep sharing our stories and keep the conversation going. Number 3,
We are ready for LGBTQ organizations to be able to register themselves under the Societies Act. Too many of our community groups have suffered because they have not been recognized for the great work they're doing. We are ready to see more positive portrayals of the LGBTQ people in our mainstream media without censorship. We need the positive role models among us to be seen by the public. We are ready for schools to support our children, regardless of theirs or their parents' sexual orientation or gender identity.
we are ready for greater access to healthcare and social services.
We are ready for businesses that embrace diversity.
We are ready for LGBTQ individuals to be seen as equal citizens in the eyes of the law.
We need to repeal 377A, an outdated law that criminalizes gay men.
We are ready to be the change we want to see. Just as Dorothy and her daughter Samantha have volunteered for Big Dog for 7 years.
So that is the video I wanted to share with you. Movements like this are happening all around the world. And for the sake of time, I will answer questions. You can just email me your questions, but I'd like to make sure that the other presenters also have time. But thank you for holding space with me, for having this human conversation. And this is me. And we can be happy and proud and thankful for our identities all around the world. Love always wins. You are worthy, and there is hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiki, for sharing. Thank you for your time, and thank you for making it very personal. I know I know it's probably tough for you, but appreciate that you made it. You made yourself vulnerable and shared your story with everyone. So thank you, Tiki. So now, since we do have a little bit of time, we will take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back at 5. We'll reconvene at 5. Right?
Okay, welcome back everyone from our break. Our second presenter is Dr. Cristina Magalhaes. She is a professor of clinical psychology in the Clinical PsyD program at Alliant Los Angeles campus. She is also a coordinator of the Rockway Certificate in LGBTQ Mental Health and Human Services. Her current research interests center on gender diversity and issues impacting LGBTQ people with a focus on transgender women. Without further ado, Dr. Magalhaes.
Thank you, Zane. Thank you, everyone. And first, I want to congratulate both Box Hill and Alliant International University for this unprecedented collaboration. And it's a pleasure to be here and to be talking to you about the Rockway Certificate, which is the topic of my presentation today. I'm going to share my screen with you. And I'm going to be toggling multiple screens. So hopefully I'll keep you with the PowerPoint that I'm going to be sharing. And if I lose that connection, please let me know. As Anne mentioned, I am coordinator of the Rockway Certificate in LGBT Studies, which is an initiative for training students at Alliant for delivering affirmative care for providers, and also in education and other areas as well. I mean, this is how the certificate started. It wasn't just for mental health, even though the majority of our students are enrolled in programs, careers that will lead them to mental health service, either at the MFT program, CFT program, counseling program, and the clinical psychology programs, both the PhD and PsyD. The students may take courses with the certificate. So here's what I have prepared for you. The presentation today, I just want to highlight two major factors that increase the demand for training, specialized training in the delivery of affirmative care to sexually diverse and gender expansive individuals in communities. And by that, I mean, just increased visibility of LGBTQ people in society at large, but also recognition that we haven't been training people in working with these communities, and there's an incredible need for affirmative professionals to be serving the communities. So it is in that context or historical context that I want to say, how and why the faculty at Alliant decided, it's time to develop a certificate that will meet that demand, and why Alliant is invested in it. I also want to talk about, our process of trying to figure out how to build a certificate that aims at building competencies for working with these communities. And so hopefully I'm going to bring you with me in trying to figure out what are the building stones or the building blocks of putting these courses together, and how to help people become more comfortable, more competent, more affirming in their delivery of services to the community. And I'll share with you also a little bit of our data that we collected from student satisfaction surveys, and trying to talk a little bit about the strengths and limitations and what we hope to change in the future for the certificate, and continue to improve and grow to meet the new demands that I'm sure are going to continue to evolve in the field. I wanted to also, before I move forward, I wanted to say that language in the community changes rapidly. And when we developed the certificate, which wasn't that long ago, it was around 2008, 2010, we were focused on using language that was LGBT. And Tiki earlier was talking about an expansion of the acronym and the importance of also having other letters in the acronym to acknowledge other groups within the LGBTQ umbrella. So just to say that I'm going to stick sometimes with the LGBT acronym just because this is how the certificate was developed in the past, but also with an acknowledgement that many other identities fall under that umbrella, and there's need for acknowledgement of those different identities, and also change in the certificate as we move forward to make it clear that we're also invested in training folks to address the needs of the entire community. So I want to spend just a few minutes talking about visibility, because I think this was really crucial around the time the certificate was developed. LGBT people and the civil rights movement for the LGBT people have been going on for many decades, and one landmark or one turning point in the fight for LGBT rights was the Stonewall riots of 1969. But certainly before that, there are other other events and other people fighting for equality, but certainly a landmark was 1969 with the Stonewall riots. The gay liberation movement of the 60s and the 70s also followed. But one thing that really became visible for mainstream society was the movement specifically around marriage equality. And that's what was going on around the time faculty at Alliant decided it was time to create a certificate for training students on LGBTQ affirmative therapy. And I remember actually around that time, I was moving from Florida to California to take my job, to take this job at Alliant. I am originally from Brazil. I went to graduate school in Florida. I lived in Florida for many years. And then I took this job at Alliant because I thought Alliant was a good home for me for many reasons. I know as a diverse person, as a person who was an international student, I came an immigrant from Brazil, and also, a member of the queer community. I felt, Alliant was the right place for me. And I was right. I came to Alliant and I found, a community of many faculty and students who were engaged in diversity training, and it became really a home for me. And around that time, the conversations were, California is passing this law that allows gay marriage. And in 2003, Massachusetts became the first state to recognize gay marriage. And the conversation really around that time was about, let's push same-sex marriage agenda. And that's when I believe really LGBT rights really became visible. And we all realizing these conversations were happening everywhere. And faculty at Alliant who were either LGBTQ identified themselves or thought of themselves as advocates, allies to the community, felt, we need to do something about this. We need to be meeting the demands for the increased visibility of the community and the backlash actually that some providers were having for some folks who did not agree with same-sex marriage, that were actually, the visibility was creating a lot of backlash at the time. So I also thought the visibility of the trans community was a marker. Jennifer Boylan is still a professor of English and literature, but at the time was working Colby College. She came out in the 2000 and she wrote an autobiography that was published and became a bestseller. So that was one event that brought the community greater visibility. There was also an influential book that came around that time in 2008 by Ida Lev. It was about transgender emergence that really changed or marked the beginning of this rapid change in professional attitudes about working with trans clients. So there was a lot of conversation about working with trans people. Nobody knew how to work with trans clients, and what can we do about it? I'd say probably in terms of visibility for the trans community on a larger scale, maybe it was coming out for Chaz Bono. I don't know who remembers here, but when Chaz came out, it was a big deal. People, in the mainstream had never heard of someone who actually had identified previously as lesbian and now was coming out as a trans man. It really brought conversations about gender identity, gender expression, gender change to, many, many homes. And these conversations were kind of shaping the context for why it was so important for us to address those issues in our training for students. Aside from visibility, there are a lot of research studies coming out about barriers to healthcare for LGBT people in general. I mean, there are a lot of empirical studies just documenting discriminations, people being denied equal treatment or being refused treatment in doctor's office, hospitals, emergency rooms, and mental health clinics. and just plain harassment, verbal harassment. And when LGBT people came to look for healthcare, not just discrimination and harassment was preventing them from seeking care, but also just realizing that the providers just did not know anything about their healthcare needs, be that physical healthcare or mental health care, but generally people did not know much about the experience of the LGBT people, and LGBT people were quite frustrated about their encounters with healthcare professionals, to say the least, and sometimes feeling directly targeted as well. So this resulted in a lot of folks just avoiding seeking care altogether, just not coming for preventive care, or even if they are sick or injured, just not going to the emergency room, not seeking any health care or counseling services was also a big deal. Folks were already feeling so pathologized and coming to a doctor's office that, or a mental health professional's office, where people would continue to pathologize them and assume that they were suffering because they were confused, because there's something wrong with their sexuality, as opposed to, hey, I'm dealing with a lot of stigma, with a lot of oppression. And yes, of course, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, but not because of my identity, but because of the social pressures that I have to face every day. So all of these things were leading to a greater recognition in among professionals in general, not just psychologists, but in all kinds of professions, including education and other places, that, well, we ought to pay attention to this population that we are underserving, and in some cases actually doing quite a great deal of harm, the way we are providing services. There was also lack of health insurance. Folks were being mistreated at work. There are no work protections, and this would result in unemployment or underemployment for many people. Specifically, trans people were significantly impacted by this because trans people or laws or policies in workplaces, they were lagging behind even more so than protections for LGBT workers. So all of these factors somehow kind of provided the zeitgeist for why it was important that Alliant would develop a certificate to train professionals. So what did we think competent care for LGBTQ individual clients and their families would look like? Well, it should be welcoming and affirming of all LGBTQ identities. And here, when I say LGBTQ, I am being the most inclusive possible. It should be knowledgeable of issues that impacted the entire community, recognizing that the community, there are diversity of experiences in that community, but should also be trauma informed, because there are many studies that will also demonstrating that LGBT people were subject to higher levels of sexual abuse, physical abuse, violence of all forms, emotional abuse for sure, and just vicarious traumatization, whether you are directly impacted or not, but just knowing that people in your community are directly impacted just created a sense of oppression and feeling traumatized by these experiences. So whoever is working with trans people, LGBT people should know that their work should be trauma informed, should also be strength-based, recognizing that folks have an incredible amount of resilience, and to focus on the positive as opposed to the negative, which, because of the history of pathologizing LGBTQ people, we just realized we need to be doing strength-based training with folks. And we also wanted, ultimately that our clinicians would develop a sense for delivering services that would be client-centered, that would be really about the client and what the client wants and what's important for the client and in the context of the client's experiences. So this is what we had in mind, and we felt it was important to kind of put together. So also around that time, there were practice guidelines for mental health professionals being made available. So the first practice guidelines for working with LGB clients was adopted by APA Council in 2020, but it was expired at the end of 2010. So we're hearing all of these conversations about, okay, we need to update this. We also hearing that the American Counseling Association had recently approved competencies for counseling transgender clients, which APA wasn't even talking about at that point. A few years later, the APA practice guidelines came out in 2015, and I believe they were working on it for maybe 4 years before that. My wife was part of that task force that worked on this particular guidelines, but I remember that being sort of a push, how come APA hasn't done anything? ACA has already, they're counseling trans clients since 2009. We need to hurry up and get something done too. But anyway, my point being, around that time, there were a lot of conversations about the importance of developing practice guidelines. And I'm just speaking to practice guidelines for mental health professionals, but this was happening also with the American Medical Association, with the National Association for School Psychologists, and every organization was paying attention and wanted to address those issues. So thinking about that and considering that Alliant's mission is to prepare students for professional careers of service and leadership, and to promote the discovery and application of knowledge to improve the lives of people in diverse cultures and communities around the world. That's our mission. Faculty thought, we need to capitalize on our resources here. Also, a good thing about Alliant, we have, at the time, we had 6 campuses in California. We also had campuses internationally. And the reality was we had a lot of LGBT identified faculty, spread around across different campuses. And we had one visionary among us, Dr. Robert J. Green. I'll introduce you to him. He's retired now, but Dr. Robert J. Green is sort of like the person behind the idea, and also the founder, the person who put all of this together. He pulled faculty from different campuses and got us all jazzed up about forming a research institute that he found funds for on his own, and he wanted to lead a think tank of both people from Alliant, but also well-known researchers in the field outside Alliant to sort of collaborate to develop research that would be assisting with the movement or the LGBT rights. Robert J. Green himself was interested in research about LGBT couples, which these studies were fundamental in making an impact on laws regarding adoption by LGBT parents. Around that time, most states would not allow LGBT people to adopt kids. And I remember that clearly because I was living in Florida, as I mentioned, and I worked with foster care. And I remember, that was one thing. We could have an LGBT family wanting to adopt or wanting to foster a kid, but the laws did not allow us to do that. So Robert J. wanted to do research that would be important and influencing those kinds of decisions, court decisions that would change laws, that would make significant big changes in people's lives. So this is Robert J. and his plans, and he did all of this while he was at Alliant. And he's still doing it. He retired from Alliant, but he's still working on his publications and his research under the umbrella of the Rockaway Institute that he founded. As an offshoot of the Rockaway Institute that he created, there is this idea that we could develop also a Rockaway certificate that was to run under the Rockaway Institute And that's when he pulled faculty from different campuses to sort of think about how to put that together. And at the time, this was pretty innovative. Other universities were not doing this. And we were really hoping to do something really new and important. You might be wondering why Rockway, and the institute was named after Alan Rockway, who was a psychologist and bisexual activist. This is a known psychologist who helped write and defend an unprecedented gay non-discrimination ordinance in 1977, and this was for Florida, Dade County in Florida. And Robert J. decided to name the institute after Alan Rockway, and also the certificate. Someone else who was also influential at that time was Sue Kuba, and some of, if there are any faculty here from that time, they'll remember Sue Kuba. She was a wonderful, we lost her a few years back. Dr. Kuba was at the time system-wide director of online education, and that's when the idea, just occurred to all of us that, hey, we need to put this online, because that's the way of reaching out students across campuses, and to ensure that we're finding folks who are teaching those courses who are experts on a particular area. So we're capitalizing on the resources we have, all faculty at different campuses, and this is going to be great for the students. And we wanted to also create something that would lead to a potential certificate if students found that that was important for their career, and would also allow some students to take one course only, as opposed to having to complete an entire certificate. There weren't that many LGBT courses available, and if it was available, it was available just for students within a particular program. We want to make this widely available. So that was sort of like the context for the development of the certificate. So what was getting in the way of competent healthcare practices, we understood, was lack of understanding of common life experiences for LGBT people, misinformation and wrong assumptions about sexuality and its relationship with gender identity, gender expression, and gender roles. Also, the history of pathologization of LGBTQ identities was getting in the way. Personal biases from the clinician was getting in the way. Lack of familiarity with the community. And also, the reality was there are very few of us who are doing this work. So usually, if you're an LGBT affirmative provider, you're probably a member of the community, and which meant we're just few of us out there doing this work. We wanted to make sure that more people could be doing this work. We recognized there were many students at Alliant that were not LGBTQ identified themselves, but were interested in acquiring these competencies. So building a new certificate, what was in our mind? Accessible to all students at Alliant. We wanted to give a breadth of exposure to issues impacting the entire community, but at the same time, being able to address students' interest in specific groups, because we realized that some students, were really interested in working with trans clients, for example, but not so much LGBT clients. Some students were really interested in working with the bisexual community, but not so much with other communities. So we thought, we need to find a way of addressing the students' interest in specific groups, but also specific areas of interest. Like, for example, some students were really interested in working with substance abuse treatment for LGBT clients, which is a major issue for the community. So we wanted to have some courses that would, for example, address that particular need, and to also showcase the faculty's areas of specialty within LGBTQ psychology, since all of us had different areas that we did research or we like to teach, or we had experience with clients. So we wanted to sort of like have also courses that would sort of showcase those areas of expertise, and also invite some major researchers in the area, a specific area, to develop a course for us and to give our students an opportunity to be taught by some folks who had been writing books about a specific topic that was, a landmark. For example, we have Dr. Ronald Fox, who wrote a book, one of the early books on bisexuality, to teach for us a course on bisexual issues. So that was sort of like important for us to sort of have folks who had a name already in the field to be participating in the certificate. We want our courses to be asynchronous. So not only we want them to be online, but we want them to be asynchronous, meaning that people do not have to be there at a particular time to watch a lecture. Like we're doing now, classes on Zoom. People need to be there from 1 to 4 to watch a lecture. But we didn't want that because that would create a barrier for students who did not have an opportunity to fit one of our courses in their schedule. So we wanted to keep that asynchronous. We wanted to be about active student learning. We did not want it to be lecture-based. We wanted to be in a way that students would, sort of help figure out what is it that they wanted to learn. So we are using a lot of flipped classroom approach or a model to education that I don't want to get too much into it because I have a lot to talk about, but we wanted to be flexible for students. We wanted them to take the direction of they thought was important for them in their learning, and to pick and choose, different topics that would help them understand better or fill in the gaps of their knowledge about LGBTQ mental health. So here's the curriculum we came up with. We came up with a foundational course of LGBT mental health. And at that time, we also developed a 1-unit professional applications issues course, which was actually more of a supervision experience. Now we discontinued this because it became very difficult to make it happen. But essentially, this was to have students find a site in the community, wherever they were, whether they're in Fresno, LA, or San Diego. They would have to kind of carve that site on their own where they could interact some more with the LGBT community. And we would provide them sort of a Rockway advisor to mentor them in developing some sort of project with the community. This was really an excellent activity we did. Unfortunately, it became unsustainable, but if I have more time, I'll talk about that later. But that was one of the things we put in place early on. And we also had, those two things were mandatory. Everybody had to take them if you wanted a certificate. But we also had the population-specific courses because we felt back then that some students might want advanced knowledge in a particular community, so they could take one of those advanced study courses. And we also had special topic courses, and many of these courses are still active. There are a few inactive courses because, like I mentioned earlier, some of the faculty who were involved were specialists in these areas, and some of them retired. They're no longer teaching, and we might bring back these courses at some point. But for example, the LGBT issues course in immigration was taught by Olivia Isbin, which is famous writer and researcher, is very well known in the psychology literature about her work with lesbian women immigrants. So she developed that course and she was teaching it for us, which was great. And just want to announce a very brand new course we're in the process of developing is LGBT Leather Community in Kink, that we're having also a well-known researcher in the area, Dr. Richard Sprout, who's president of APA Division 44 currently, actually, to develop this course for us. He has published several books on this, and we attracted him to teach this course for us, which I'm super excited about. Will probably be available in spring of 2022. So in thinking about how to train on LGBT affirmative mental health, we borrow from the diversity training model that we've been using to train many students in many different aspects of diversity. So kind of learn that it's important to help students achieve awareness of their own personal values, belief systems, and attitudes towards a particular community. We also want to give them knowledge, specific knowledge, foundational knowledge, factual information about that community. And we want to build skills. We want to build the skills that will help the students deliver whatever competent care they are hoping to deliver for that community. So we borrow that model in thinking about our designing of the coursework. And I want actually give you an opportunity to think about this. If you're asked to help design a Rockway course, how would you address these three areas: awareness, knowledge, and skills, in terms of developing your curriculum? So just to make this a little more interactive, I want to give you a couple minutes to think about this. First, we'll start with awareness, and I'll ask you, what experiences would you include in the curriculum that would help students gain self-awareness regarding their own beliefs and attitudes toward LGBTQ people? If you had to develop this course and you were asked that question, what would you do? I am hoping that maybe you can use the chat to, some of you, just give us some ideas. Thinking about awareness. All right, everyone, put your teacher hats on. You're trying to build a curriculum for Rockway. How would you help a student gain self-awareness? What would you do? Privilege walks. I'm very interested in speaking with you in just a little. Okay. I would have to be more aware, knowledgeable of the content and material prior to offering advice, self-reflective exercises like the Trusted 10, self-identity model, self-identity wheel, etc. Those are very good. Yeah. Well, don't shy away from giving an idea. Think about yourself. What would help you become more self-aware regarding your own beliefs? Would you enjoy an exercise, for example, of, interviewing someone in the community and getting some firsthand knowledge if you're not familiar with the community? Would you be interested in maybe writing reflection papers or, so those are the kinds of things faculty are trying to figure out. How do we help students gain that self-awareness? So in terms of knowledge, what topics would you consider essential to include in your syllabus? What would you put in that syllabus if you had to come up with a Rockway course? You had design, building off of what Tiki was talking about earlier, some of the stereotypes about the community. What are things that should be in that course that would help sort of dispel some of those myths? What would be a topic? Maybe something you don't know that you would like to know more. And in fact, this is kind of like the question that we ask a lot of our students at the end of the course. Is that something that you wish we had included in the course that we didn't, that you didn't know, but you wish you could know? Good point. Like a difference from Zane, gender expression versus gender identity versus sexual orientation. That's definitely one big important topic to include. An objective understanding of where myths originated from. Well, that's a good idea. Okay. So those are the kind of things we're trying to come up with. I like that from Michael Lowy, introduced to Bear community. And in fact, there are many different communities within the larger LGBT community. So I like the idea of introducing students to different communities and specific communities without the LGBT community. So anyway, those are the things that Rockway instructors were trying to figure out. And in terms of skills, what type of skills would your students need to have to work effectively with the LGBT community, and how would your course help develop these skills? So that's the other challenge, right? What do we do to help folks figure out how to apply theory to practice and actually translate that knowledge into specific skill? So, I'm a clinician, so it's hard for me to think outside of a skill that it's not applied to clinical practice. But, the certificate also can be taken by students in educational programs too, and apply some of these skills to the educational setting. But when I'm teaching to clinicians, one of the things that I want my students to know, for example, is to know how to develop treatment plans that are appropriate for their clients. So that would be sort of like an example of a skill that we were thinking about when putting these courses together. So let me move to the next slide. So building the courses to meet the training needs of future care providers, we are also challenged in thinking, who are those students who are coming to take these courses with us? And we realized that many students who were initially taking these courses with us were more advanced in their knowledge of the LGBT community. They already were part of the community. But eventually, over the years, actually, we had students who were not part of the community. And currently, actually, the majority of our students in these courses, they're not part of the community. This is their first introduction to LGBTQ community. And we sort of had to find a way of meeting the needs of both groups of students. Of course, this is a continuum, right? We don't have like the super knowledgeable and the student who doesn't know anything, zero. But we have, of course, people with different levels of knowledge of the community from 0 to 100 and all grades in between, all shades in between. So for students with limited exposure to the LGBTQ community, our goal was to create opportunities for these students to examine their own beliefs and attitudes, give feedback to students about how they come across. It was a big deal, right? Especially when you're doing online education, a lot of the communications are in writing. And this is actually quite good because when students are writing and they are using terminology that is inappropriate, is offensive, it's an opportunity to faculty to give them feedback and say, hey, when you say, I worked with this homosexual client, that doesn't ring, very well for people because we don't use that terminology anymore. So you want to say, when I worked with my gay client, well, that sounds more contemporary. So we could give that kind of feedback to students in terms of how they are coming across when they are talking about LGBTQ issues. We wanted to expose them to information that can help dispel myths about sexuality and gender. The nature of LGBTQ relationships was super important, and also to give historical context for the LGBT civil rights movement in the US, because frankly, most people who are not familiar with the community, they don't know this has been going on for such a long time. They kind of think of the civil rights movement as something that is happening today because it's the first time they heard. But yes, we do have a long history of this, and there are important landmarks that need to be recognized and understood so that you can translate that to understanding generational differences, for example, in how your clients might feel about their own identities. And in terms of skills, we wanted to introduce, again, students to appropriate language for engaging effectively with clients. And we want to help them practice, develop affirming client-centered, trauma-informed, strengths-based, and diversity-sensitive treatment plans for their clients. So this is for the student who's coming in with very little knowledge of the community. But how do we meet the needs of students who have a lot of exposure to LGBT community already, which we have several? Well, the reality is that having exposure to the community doesn't necessarily translate into knowing how to work with the community. And in creating awareness, a lot of our work involves creating these opportunities for the students to examine their limits, or they might think that they are overly prepared to work with the community, but they might know a lot about one sub-community and know nothing about the other. So helping students realize what they know and what they don't know and what they need to know more was also part of the work, is part of the work that we do with students who already come with a lot of exposure to the LGBT community. And for many of those students, while they have personal knowledge of the community, they don't know necessarily a whole lot about what does the professional literature say about the work we need to do. So we wanted to expose them to empirically based knowledge about the community and to help them refine their ability to identify relevant issues that need addressing clinically. So this is kind of like our challenge. I want to move on and talk a little bit about our student surveys. And I just selected a few quotes from the student surveys. This is not a course survey, so this is about the certificate. For students who completed the entire certificate, which not all students do. Some students will take just a few courses here and there. But for those who complete the entire certificate, we asked them, what did you like most about the certificate? So one of the highlights for sure, and we keep hearing this over and over, I like the professors from different campuses taught the courses. I feel like I learned from the best. The certificate has been an excellent talking point at interviews. So there's sort of like a marketing value for students when they're graduating, and it gives them a competitive edge. So those are sort of like the comments that we were getting from students who completed the certificate. Another one that also says, I love the certificate was offered. I have a strong interest in working with this population and wanted to make sure I was competent to do so. With other classes jammed with information, the LGBTQ community was typically covered quickly or briefly mentioned, and I wanted to learn more. I specifically loved Dr. Giamate's class. They were challenging, but very, very informative and really shaped me into the clinician I am today. I'm very pleased with the certificate process and the courses offered when I was talking to them. So I'm going to skip this next slide, which is also about good things, but I want to get to some of the challenges also. And we asked them, what suggestions might you have for enhancing the quality of learning and overall experience for Rockway students? And I selected a few that sort of highlight a few things that students are asking for. More opportunities for self-reflection. So we had some students in different ways asking for that, and I just selected this one quote that says, have students do deep self-disclosures when they present projects in the course. I mean, for anyone who teaches diversity-related courses, we know this is probably one of the most challenging aspects to address in a course, is to, create opportunities for self-reflection, but that awareness piece of the diversity training model, right? How do we create these opportunities in a way that feels safe, non-threatening, and people can really reflect and challenge their beliefs? So our students were asking for more. Wider range of topic selection. Assuming there's a challenge, this is challenging with limited people pursuing the certificate, but more access to classes would have been helpful. So we try to keep it a wide range, but we don't have a lot of students taking the certificate. So they, like I said, they might take one course here and there. So we can only keep some electives available, and we try to rotate them every 2 to 3 years, make them available. And one thing that was suggested for improvement would be a mechanism for linking students with practicum sites. I mean, we are not a full program that can really ensure that students have an opportunity to link up with practicum sites, but that would be definitely ideal. I have to say this would be an area for growth for us. We'd love to be able to see the certificate going in that direction, but that might be beyond the scope of what we can offer. But these students are looking for assistance, looking up sites after graduation, or getting some opportunity for direct exposure. And one other comment that I think is very relevant and also kind of hard to address, but something definitely on our to-do list, faculty involved in the certificate to kind of think how we're going to ensure that the courses don't overlap so much. But the reality is, because students can take any of those courses that are a little bit of introductory material we need to go over in almost every course. So students who are taking multiple Rockway courses might see content being included in multiple courses that they're like, okay, I've seen this before. But our challenge is, how do we meet the needs of every student who comes to class and who has very limited exposure to the topics we're addressing. And one couple last things I wanted to say as I'm wrapping up. One question we asked also our students is, what factor was most important in your decision to pursue the Rockway certificate in addition to your degree? And hands down, our students are saying a certificate in LGBT studies would prepare me to better serve a community I care about. It's the number one thing our students are saying drives them to complete the certificate. And the second thing would be employability. And the third thing would be convenience. But certainly our students are thirsty for knowledge. They want to know more. They want to serve the communities, which is what we are hoping for. And my last thought would be on a attitudes continuum scale, which this particular scale was developed by Riddle in the 70s and actually published in 1994, but developed earlier, to kind of show a progression of attitudes, a continuum of attitudes. And the red words meaning negative attitudes and the green words meaning positive attitudes. We certainly want to move our students from the red side of the scale to the green side of the scale, where we're aiming for students who can be supportive but also admire, appreciate, celebrate, and nurture the LGBT communities they serve as providers. So I'll stop here because I'm running out of time. And I know we're going into a break, but I'm happy to stick around if you have any questions. And those who want to go on break, feel free to go. This is the end of my presentation.
Okay, with that said, if those who want to stay and discuss anything with Dr. Magalhaes, you can stay behind. But there's another 10-minute break. For us, it'd be 6 p.m. and for the Aussie time, it'll be 11 a.m. So return back.
So real quick, Dr. M, I just have one quick question, and thanks again. I know you know how I feel about you. With the urgency of the violence against specifically Black trans females, is any consideration being given to how we can better prepare students or just the community in general to be a little more proactive because of the urgency? I mean, they're like dying daily, and it's just so obvious that there's a huge disparity, particularly with that group. Do you know of anything that's being done to address that?
Well, in the context of the certificate, I know for sure this is definitely one topic that many of our instructors will include in their syllabus. I know I included in mine. I teach a course in intersections of diversity within the community, which is meant to raise awareness that the community has many different subgroups that are not different just in terms of their identities, but also their experiences that are influenced by their other minority statuses. So definitely we talk about the intersection of race, ethnicity, trans identity, and other LGBTQ identities, and how that impacts and shapes and changes and adds the stressors, and add also points of resilience in different ways and nuances for how to work with these communities. So I know I addressed that issue in my course, but I'm pretty sure other instructors will also address some of these issues. And specifically for Black trans women, that is a topic that, is very clear in the professional literature. There's a lot of documentation in terms of research findings that support a need and an urgency for addressing the needs of that particular community. So I know I address it, but I'm pretty sure other instructors address it too.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. And one last thing, do you see at all, because of all the deceptive narratives kind of created systemically about African Americans, that there could be a course specific to African Americans in general, just to kind of better prepare folks, because a lot of the literature we're finding out wasn't as inclusive. But yeah, African Americans, but African American sexual gender minorities, just like a whole class on that population, because I know even me as an African American, I have a lot of misconceptions because of the things that I was taught in academia about the African American population that was not accurate because it was not really inclusive. So I was just wondering about that.
We do not have currently a course that addresses specifically the needs of the African American community within the LGBT community. That would be an excellent topic. We'll have to find an instructor to develop that.
We'll chat. Thank you, Dr. Emma. Thank you for showing up, and thanks for the invite.
You're welcome. Good to see you, Cherise.
Good to see you too. Bye-bye.
Welcome back, everyone, from our break. Our third presenter is Dr. Jennifer Staples. She is a white, straight, able-bodied, cisgendered woman who identifies as agnostic and is in her 30s. She was born in Vermont on unceded Abenaki land and is a first-generation college student. Dr. Staples received her doctorate at the University of Washington in Seattle and obtained a postdoctoral specialty in LGBTQIA+ mental health and trauma. Her research focuses on oppression-based traumatic stress among transgender and gender-expansive adults. She is currently an associate professor at Alliant and co-founded a work group on advocacy for transgender and gender-expansive students. The floor is yours, Dr. Staples.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me share my screen. All right, you should be able to see the full screen now. Great, so I thank you for everyone for hanging in there with us. This is a long time to be on Zoom and in the evening for San Diego, and I'm really honored to have been invited to be a speaker. So I'm going to be talking tonight about engaging in institutional advocacy, and I'm specifically going to use an example of a group we have developed at Alliant to give you some tangible ideas of what advocacy can look like. So as Zane mentioned, I included my positionality in my bio because I think it's helpful when giving a talk or teaching a class to really acknowledge the unique worldview that I'm operating from. We all inevitably are shaped by our identities and it impacts our work. And so I like to acknowledge areas of privilege where I strive to be an ally. So I'm white, straight, a cisgender woman, able-bodied, I'm young, 34. And also honoring the land that I grew up on and that I work on. So Alliant San Diego campus was built on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. So I think that's important to acknowledge as well. As Zane mentioned, I grew up in a working class family and was a first generation college student, but I now hold the privilege of having my PhD and doctorate. And my family actually has really shaped my work. So my sibling is 9 years older than me, and when I was about 10, they came out initially as lesbian, and their sexual and gender identity has evolved over the years, and they now, they identify as queer in terms of their sexuality, but they also recently identified as genderqueer and use they, them pronouns. So this has definitely been a personal stake in the work that I do. I think it's motivated a lot of my professional path and my reason to pursue an LGBTQIA+ mental health and trauma fellowship. So I also want to start by talking about terminology, and I think we could have a whole 45-minute talk about terminology, but I want to talk about some of the terms I'll be using throughout the presentation. So as Dr. Magalhaes referenced, there's some critiques of using LGBT. So LGBT or LGBTQIA+ is still pretty widely used in the community and the research world. However, it has been shifting a little bit, at least in the research, because one of the concerns is that it really lumps two distinct concepts into one acronym. So we're talking about sexual identity and gender identity and shoving them into an acronym. And then historically, really, transgender people have been left out. So a lot of the earlier research, not even that long ago, they'll say they use LGBT samples, but if you look at their methods, you'll see they maybe had one or two trans participants and they're often excluded from analyses. So they've often been invisible in this acronym. And although they share common experiences of oppression, I think it's important to acknowledge the distinct groups. Also within sexual orientation and gender identity, it's really diverse. There's so many different terms that are used for people to identify. And so the term LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans is just a few identity labels that people use. So it's always hard for me to decide what terms to use when I'm presenting. And since I'm presenting on such broad heterogeneous groups, I decided to go with sexual and gender minorities. We do see this in the literature, SGM, although it's also been critiqued, so I'll acknowledge that. I actually liked, I think Dr. Magalhaes had sexually diverse and gender expansive, and I like that. So with sexual minority, it's really a diverse umbrella term that includes people who identify in all different ways: gay, queer, asexual, pansexual, kind of the plus of what we often see in the acronym. And then for gender minorities, similarly, some people who fit under the transgender umbrella don't actually use the term transgender to identify. And a term that I've been seeing more frequently is gender expansive, which really describes individuals who stretch and expand culture's conceptions of gender identity, gender expression, roles, and norms. So you'll see me using some of this language interchangeably. When I refer to past research, I might use the language that they actually use in the study. Okay, so I want to start by talking about some mental health disparities that we see among SGM students. So one study found that sexual minority college students reported higher anxiety and depression compared to their heterosexual peers. Bisexual college students reported increased risk of substance use and greater consequences related to substance use. And we also know that sexual and gender minorities are at increased risk for suicidality. So already among students, suicide is the second leading cause of death. And we know from research that sexual minority college students are more likely to think about and attempt suicide and report fewer reasons for living compared to their heterosexual peers. Furthermore, in terms of gender minorities, transgender individuals are at increased risk of suicide. And I don't know if you all are familiar with one of the largest US national surveys conducted by James and colleagues, with over 28,000 transgender individuals, found that 41% had reported attempting suicide in their lifetime. So it's a significant disparity. And then when we add these intersecting identities of race, SES, disability status, that can further impact risk. So why do we have these mental health disparities? Well, ultimately, these individuals face pervasive discrimination and oppression. So we know that LGBTQ college students are 2 times more likely to report verbal harassment compared to heterosexual peers. And in the same study by Rankin and colleagues, 87% of trans masculine students and 82% of trans feminine college students reported being harassed based on their gender identity. So those are huge numbers. And people also are experiencing verbal harassment and physical harassment in K through 12 that follows them into university years. So a theory that has been receiving more and more research attention that attempts to explain the impacts of discrimination is minority stress theory. So Meyer in 2003 is actually who made this. People often cite and reference minority stress theory, and Meyer developed this theory for sexual minorities. However, I actually recently learned that this theory dates back further to Virginia Brooks in 1981, who referenced minority stress with lesbian women, and she often doesn't receive credit in terms of acknowledging that she had thought about this theory prior to Meyer. So I wanted to give proper credit here. And then later in 2012, Hendricks and Testa applied this model for trans and gender expansive individuals, and it's since been used to apply to all different types of marginalized group, this concept of minority stress. So essentially the idea is that health disparities result from chronic systemic discrimination. And this can include violence, harassment, microaggressions, interpersonal discrimination, familial rejection, and lack of institutional support, which is what I'll be focusing on today. So ultimately, the idea is that the disparities that we see in the literature are not a result of individual pathology, it's a result of this systemic minority stress. And then I also want to acknowledge multiple minority stress. So in reference to the question from the last talk, not all SGM individuals experience stress equally, and some groups are at increased risk. So individuals who have multiple marginalized identities may have more discrimination, rejection, and lack of safety and support. And specifically, transgender, Black transgender individuals are at increased risk of sexual assault compared to both transgender and cisgender students. So it's important to acknowledge that students at the intersections of these identities have unique experiences and unique needs. So when we're talking about SGM students, we need to also think about SGM students of color, international students, students with disabilities, and first-generation college students. These individuals may actually be experiencing oppression or minority stress where they're seeking support for their sexual or gender identity. So for example, a lot of LGBTQ campus centers around the country are predominantly white. So if a BIPOC individual, Black, Indigenous, or person of color goes to seek support, they may actually experience further stress or microaggressions because perhaps the individuals there aren't prepared to talk about race or put the burden on them to focus on race. So it's important to acknowledge students' unique needs because of these multiple identities. Now, most research focuses on the negative impact of minority stress, and it's important to acknowledge resilience as well. So there's been some research showing how discrimination can actually empower SGM students to get involved in activism. And so I tried to do my best to get more research specifically with Australian samples, so you'll see that sprinkled throughout. So 25% of Australian gender diverse students said they had that their experiences of transphobia at school led them to activism. Gender diverse young people in Australia were 2 times as likely to be involved in activism compared to their cisgender peers. And activism has been found to help gender diverse youth feel better about their gender identity, feel part of a community, reduce mental health symptoms, and feel more resilient. So when we're thinking about institutional advocacy, we can also think about how to involve students in these efforts, which may actually be very empowering for students who identify as sexual or gender minorities. And our campus climate plays a role in SGM students' experience of minority stress. So it's essential that we're considering a sense of safety on a broad systemic level. So the majority of LGBTQ youth in a 2013 GLSEN US survey reported feeling unsafe in school. Transgender youth in the US perceived the school climate as less safe than their cisgender peers, and school climate included things like school connectedness, relationships with adults, use of bathrooms and changing rooms. And Douglas et al. Found that gender diverse youth reported poor school safety climate and more barriers to help seeking than their cisgender peers. So it's essential that if we're providing an affirming school climate, we may be able to increase perceptions of safety. And affirming campus services have been found to be associated with positive mental health and academic outcomes among SGM students. Feeling comfortable disclosing one's identities and receiving support after disclosure is associated with positive perceptions of a campus climate. And on the flip side, we know that hostile campus climates are associated with academic disengagement, decreased academic performance, lower identity disclosure, school truancy, and decreased support. And when we think of the word hostile, we might think of more explicit verbal aggression or physical aggression, but hostile campus climates can also just be lacking in affirming services, lacking gender neutral restrooms, lacking appropriate language, lacking support groups. And it could include things like microaggressions, making assumptions that individuals have husbands or wives, for example. We also know that students' belief about their campus environment affects their sense of belonging, and sense of belonging has been found to be closely associated with retention among college students. I know at our university, we've been doing some troubleshooting and brainstorming because we're noticing that a lot of our students who are students of color or who are queer or trans are more likely to drop out than white, cis, and straight students. There was a qualitative study done recently, and this quote comes from this, with 16 key informants who work with LGBT youth. And it says, it's up to the institution, like the school board, to be able to foster and create safe environments for queer youth and to make it clear that this is a queer positive space. So it really acknowledges this need for institutional systemic accountability. So what does that look like? Well, SGM inclusive policies and services really vary across universities, and this can look a variety of different ways. So I wanted to take a minute to ask you all what you think this could look like. So there's no right answer to this, but what are some ideas for how you can create an inclusive, affirming environment on campus? And go ahead and type it into the chat. What types of services or policies or changes might need to be made for SGM individuals to feel included on campus? Yeah, gender neutral bathrooms, absolutely. And this, sometimes there's some challenges. There's building codes, and so there might be some pushback and having to navigate that. Targeted counseling services, great. Targeted counseling services with competent, knowledgeable providers who maybe went through the Rockway Institute. Any other ideas? Okay, well, I'm glad we're doing this talk. So there's lots of different ways that you can have improved policies and services. So explicit non-discrimination policies that include sexual orientation and gender identity, and making it clear where these policies are posted. Using inclusive language in program handbooks and university documents. So you'll see later that one thing we're doing that might seem small and simple, but can have a huge impact, is changing references that are she-her to they-them. We know that they-them is acknowledged as an appropriate singular pronoun. It's been adopted by the American Psychological Association. So that's one small way that you can have a big impact. Having campus resource centers, campus programming, as Sabrina mentioned, health and mental health access with competent therapists. Explicit inclusion in the classroom, and this can be both in terms of the language that you use, the topics covered, but also just including queer and trans authors on your syllabi. So it doesn't have to be a queer or trans related topic, but you can still acknowledge queer and trans related trans authors. Trainings and continuing education opportunities, gender inclusive restrooms, a process in place for a gender name change, which I'll talk about a little bit later. If you have dormitories, gender inclusive housing. So this is just a small list, but the list could go on. So one useful resource is the Campus Pride Index, which is a national listing of LGBTQ friendly colleges and universities in the US. And so I'm using my doctoral university, the University of Washington, as an example. Alliant's not on here, I think, because it's a smaller graduate institution. So the Campus Pride Index is an overall indicator of institutional commitment to inclusive policy, program, and practice. And you get a rating of 0 to 5, and it has 8 different indices. So I was pleased to see that University of Washington scored 5 out of 5. So the 8 indices are listed here in purple. So you can see that they are looking for LGBTQ policy inclusion, support and institutional commitment, academic life, student life, housing and residence life, campus safety, counseling and health, and recruitment and retention efforts. And then they break each one down for each campus, and they show you what might go underneath these categories to be considered inclusive, and then areas for growth. So I'm just going to highlight the first 2 because they really pertain more to this institutional support. So you can see here for LGBTQ policy inclusion and support and institutional commitment, the University of Washington's doing pretty well. So they have non-discrimination statements, they have a process for students to change their name, they have some alley programs and safe spaces. However, there is still room for growth. For example, students don't have the option to self-identify their sexual or gender identity on documents, and they don't have an alumni group. So what you can do at your institution might be limited based on resources, but I think this is a useful resource to start thinking about some practical changes that can be made. Another resource is the APAG's Guide for Supporting Trans and Gender Diverse Students, which was developed by the Committee on Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity. And this guide's really intended for leaders in graduate psychology education, and they provide 8 basic guidelines, and some of which we have overlapped with what we've talked about. So including, the first one is including pronouns as part of class introductions. So there's various ways to do this, and it's important that you're not forcing an individual to share their pronouns, because you could be unintentionally forcing an individual to disclose an identity they're not ready to disclose. But it's helpful to model at the start of class, for example, share your name, your pronouns, your year in school, and a fun fact about yourself. And then I could say, hi, I'm Dr. Staples, she, her, hers, da, 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 da. And then if students share it, great. And if they don't, I wouldn't necessarily pressure them to. Other people prefer to have students do introductions prior to the start of class, so it can be a little more intimate and students might be able to share in advance. So there's actually a website, and I forget the name of it, I meant to look it up, where you can submit small videos. So the students can submit a little introductory video and you can give them prompts. So then before class, you have some of this information and it might be more personal. It's also important to use gender inclusive language. One thing I've been working on, for example, is I'm from the Northeast of the US and I say you guys a lot. And I actually had a group once when I was leading a transgender support group at the VA hospital. And they mentioned that I used you guys in a room full of primarily trans women. And that really, of course, made me more aware of it. So I try to use language like you all instead, that's more inclusive. Expanding options on demographic forms, receiving training, we've mentioned some of these. Also challenging binary assumptions about gender. So I think we've alluded to this throughout the symposium today, but gender extends beyond the binary, absolutely. And I think that any chance we get to challenge binary assumptions, including language, I think is helpful for moving our students forward. And then centering queer and trans people of color in discussions about transness. So again, acknowledging that not all gender minorities share the same identities. There's multiple intersecting identities, and trans and queer people of color are sometimes at increased risk and have unique needs. So I'm going to shift gears now, and I want to talk specifically about some advocacy work that we've been doing at Alliant University, specifically with transgender and gender expansive. So again, I'm focusing on that one part of this acronym now, and I'm going to use TGE, or transgender and gender expansive, throughout. So we developed a work group, and our working title is the Transgender and Gender Expansive Faculty Work Group, but it's ongoing. We're trying to figure out the best name for us. So I want to acknowledge my work group members, which includes Dr. Magalhaes. So certainly this has been a joint effort, and I am presenting on this right now, but I want to acknowledge all of the hard work of all of our work group members, and I believe Michael Lowy is here tonight. So our work group actually was prompted because Dr. Estrellado and I gave a training on the APAGS guide for supporting trans and gender diverse students to a small group of faculty. And at the end, we identified a list of institutional action steps that we can take. And our list was pretty long. And so we were thinking about the best way to address these action steps. And so we actually thought about developing a work group to start addressing these action steps. And so Dr. E and I were thinking, how can we get some assistance with this? Like, I'm sure things are already being done across campuses because we have multiple campuses at Alliant. So how can we, draw from those experiences that are already happening? So we ended up reaching out to other faculty members across campuses. And I actually included all of the language here in some of the emails. And I can share my slide deck after, because I actually find this sometimes intimidating as a early career psychologist, and probably some students too, of how to draft an email. And so I have an email later to leadership that I'll also show. That's why I included the whole email. But essentially we were just asking to connect with other faculty members with expertise and with gender identity, transgender and non-binary issues, and our goal being to support students across Alliant. And so we ended up recruiting, we have 7 core faculty who formed our work group in September of 2020, and we currently meet monthly. So in our initial work group meeting, we reviewed existing efforts to affirm TGE students across Alliant campuses. So we talked about, your campus has all gender inclusive restrooms. How did you get that to happen? We're running up against this barrier. And, you did this great training. Tell us, who you were partnered with. And we really shared ideas. And then we ended up brainstorming action items. How can we move forward? We pretty quickly just decided our goal was to put forward initiatives. And so we just brainstormed items, started prioritizing them, and then presented initial action items to leadership. So I wanted to show you what our initial brainstorm looked like. And this is from our meeting minutes. So you can see each bullet point as a different action item, and then we ended up highlighting ones that were higher priority. So we had some items that we didn't think were as pressing, such as developing a business card template with with faculty pronouns, especially since it was during COVID at the time, so nobody was in person exchanging business cards, but that's still on our list of action items that we hopefully can address in the future. So the items that we really attended to were, first of all, hiring student workers to help us to start to develop a list of queer and trans authors for curriculum. We know that this is often a barrier for faculty in decolonizing their syllabi, is knowing where to look and who to include and not having the expertise. So we thought it could be really helpful to get some help from a student to do this. We haven't worked on that yet. And then one of our plans was to try to change our admission forms, our new student information system, our HR paperwork to be more gender inclusive. So we talked about what that might look like. And ideally, it's the ability to just open-ended include your gender identity or your sexual orientation, whatever's necessary in the moment, and not have to select a limited box and maybe not even have to disclose your sex assigned at birth because it might be totally irrelevant to your job. So we ran up against some challenges, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then one of our biggest challenges was to change the name on all different systems, starting with email, if it wasn't a legal name change. And this actually came up because of a challenge that someone brought to our work group with being able to change their name in a seamless way. So that was one of our top priority items. So this is the email that we drafted to leadership, and who we sent it to is, at the time we had a leader in the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion office who I had already worked with separately through a diversity group. And she was a good advocate for us and a liaison with leadership. And we also sent it to our provost. And so we identified the two things that we wanted. And then you can see is that we were trying to be strategic about how to provide some support to our requests. So we included, for example, California's Gender Recognition Act, which emphasizes the importance of marking a non-binary option on legal documents to help provide support for changing systems that were just male and female. We also included reference to California's Fair Employment and Housing Council, indicating that employers must use an employee's preferred name and gender pronouns. So we wanted to be friendly, but also strategic about how we presented this to leadership. Unfortunately, our leadership wants to be supportive. They just don't always know the best ways. Now, if we could back up, so we kind of dove right in with our action steps, but reflecting on this, I was thinking about if you wanted to form a similar group at your institution. I think certainly identifying faculty and staff that have interest in advocacy and establishing your goals and mission. But I think what could have been helpful for our group and still could be in the future would actually be to conduct a needs assessment. So this could be town halls where you gather people and try to assess, okay, what is our institution doing well? What does our institution need to improve on? What are you looking for? Or it could be more confidential, such as through a climate survey where you actually are asking pointed questions. And separately through our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion office, where I was a chair for a while, we did develop a climate survey, a diversity climate survey for all of Alliant, but it was broad. It wasn't focused specifically on sexual orientation and gender identity. So we definitely have used some of that to inform our initiatives, but I think it could be really helpful to actually start with a needs assessment, and then you can use that needs assessment to prioritize your initiatives. So what our typical work group looks like, and this has kind of evolved naturally, is that we start by reviewing progress on prior action items. So again, we're only meeting once a month, so a lot can happen between then, and there's email exchanges. So we review action, we troubleshoot barriers, and then we potentially just go forward with our next action step regarding those barriers, or we review new action items, prioritize them, and then identify action steps. And what I've tried to do is in the minutes, bold the action steps that are needed and really identify who's going to take care of each action step so we can try to be efficient. So one question we had is, who should we include in the work group? And so we knew we were including interested faculty and staff across campuses, but we weren't sure whether to include students. And we went back and forth on this. We thought like, well, they're the stakeholder that really motivated this group, so maybe we should include them. And then we thought perhaps there's too many cooks in the kitchen. And sometimes we actually discuss specific student concerns. So we ultimately decided for now not to include students, but we encourage students to initiate their own work group. And one of our work group members had been working with a student who was interested in this idea. And so they've since established their own student leaders, their own work group with goals and initiatives. And so we might work together over time. Also, we've talked about, when the student work group developed, whether they wanted to have only SGM identified individuals or whether they wanted to include allies as well. And ultimately, both groups agreed that it would be helpful to include allies. So that's what I want to talk about next is my role striving to be an ally. So first, I want to say that really, you can't self-identify as an ally. You are identified by the group you're trying to serve as an ally for as being an ally or not. So I always try to say striving to be an ally because that is really what I do. So there's lots of different definitions, and I recently actually co-authored an article about allyship, and so I could talk about this for a while, but I'll try to keep it somewhat concise. So an ally can be defined as people with privilege that choose to leverage their power to fight oppression for those in marginalized groups. And so really, it was important to acknowledge my privilege and try to use that power for structural change. So there are some benefits to including people with these privileged identities because it might be less risky for them to do advocacy. So for example, if I'm writing an email to leadership, I don't have to worry about my sense of minority stress regarding sexual orientation and gender identity. I don't have to worry about questions about that. And so it might be less risky if I'm making those requests. It's also important to avoid the spotlight and work alongside marginalized community members. And some people prefer the term accomplice or co-conspirator rather than ally, because really you're working hand in hand. Now, ironically, today there was an Alliant email that went out, and every month or so we get an email that's like, in the spotlight is what it's called, and it highlights faculty in the spotlight. And they happen to spotlight this symposium. And so there's my photo along with some of the others. And I'm like, oh, here I am saying, avoid the spotlight, and I'm directly in the spotlight. So again, want to acknowledge the group that I'm working with because it's important to not pretend like I'm the face of this group. And it's an ongoing process of reflecting, consulting disadvantaged group members, and being open and receptive to feedback. So I regularly consulted with the co-founder of this group and helped use their approach as a model. So for example, early on, I was unsure when I sent emails to leadership whether I should name all of our group members or whether some of them wanted to remain anonymous because of their identity factors. And my co-leader was like, why don't you just ask the group members if they want to be named? And I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So that's something I've been trying to do is, do you want to be named in XYZ communication? Sometimes they may want to be named, sometimes they may want to be anonymous. And so I've been trying as someone striving to be an ally to take on roles that can reduce burden rather than add to the burden. So in this group, my role has become like doing scheduling, setting the agenda, taking minutes. And I receive specific feedback that this role is helpful. So that most of our faculty are at capacity. And so attending a group, taking an hour to attend a meeting is hard enough, but having to do some of these other tasks is challenging. So I think that in this group, this was welcomed. However, that might not always be the case. So in some groups, if you're taking on that role, someone else who's a member of the marginalized group you're advocating for might want to be in that kind of leadership role. So I really find this role is a dance of stepping up and stepping back and trying to be vulnerable and ask for feedback and also accept that feedback and change when necessary. So I wanted to share some of the outcomes that we have achieved, which I was really proud of when I looked at this since September of 2020 during COVID. We have been able to achieve quite a bit. So I think our biggest accomplishment is a preferred name change policy. So we have a clear policy now in place where anybody who wants to change their name can submit a request, and IT helps so that it then gets changed in all the systems that it can be changed in. So the email, class rosters, Canvas. Now, the caveat is that it can't be changed in all systems, and we kind of have gone back and forth on this. And unfortunately, due to some federal requirements, not all systems can be changed, but now we have an explanation for why that is. So it doesn't just feel like the institution doesn't care, there's XYZ reason. We also are in the process of revising program handbooks to include affirming language. We have added inclusive gender options to HR and admissions paperwork and the student information statement. And as I mentioned before, sometimes this isn't always possible the way we want it to happen. So it's really been a process of going back and forth to figure out how we can get as much as we can. And so now we have statements where if you can't indicate your gender identity or sexual orientation in an open way, like why that is. We helped facilitate a Transgender Awareness Month event and drafted a statement to distribute to our university about Transgender Awareness Month. We, as I mentioned, facilitated the development of the TGE student work group. We also added a statement, we distributed a statement from the provost's office about adding pronouns to the signature, to our faculty signatures. And it was really great to see a lot of faculty who followed through in putting their pronouns in the signature line. We wanted this to be more of mandated rather than optional, but we understand the challenges there. And so we are now in the process of adding faculty pronouns to the website. And then one of our work group members, KJ Conover, took the lead on developing a guide for how to use they, them pronouns, because we know this is a challenge. And the guide is really excellent. So I'm happy to share with anyone if you want to email me at some point. I think Dr. Conover would be okay with that. And we're in the process of developing a training for how to use this guide. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that effective advocacy really required collaboration with multiple departments. So we were collaborating with the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office, the President and Provost Office, Human Resources, IT, Marketing and Communications. And so this is really a system-wide effort. In isolation, our work group would not have been able to accomplish the tasks we did. So with institutional advocacy, it's important to collaborate. So some of our next steps, we're in the process of developing a transgender and gender expansive consultant to our DEI office with a graduate student assistant. We've realized that Alliant in general and our DEI office specifically lacks some knowledge and expertise in this area. And so fortunately, our new DEI director has been open to actually developing a paid consultant role, and that's in the works. We also are in the process of planning a system-wide training with a panel of experts from the community, and we want this training to focus on institutional advocacy. And our hope is to actually get someone willing to review some of our policies and procedures and get feedback so that we can make changes. And we also hope in the future to have an SGM mixer to increase connection with faculty and students. So I want to acknowledge some of our challenges encountered. So one challenge was really a lack of understanding of nuances in this area by other departments. And I don't think it was a lack of wanting to help in most circumstances. It was just not understanding, like, why is it so important that we have faculty pronouns on the signature line? Or why is it so important that it's changed in the class roster? The professor's the only one who can see it. So it really required ongoing education, persistent follow-up. And fortunately, IT and HR were willing to have meetings and emails, and they even sent drafts for our committee to review and make sure that they got it right, which I think is great. We also had a transition in our DEI leadership, which I mentioned. And so our previous ally that we had for us left, and some of our requests slipped through the cracks. And our new DEI director, I think, lacked some awareness in this area, but that's really what prompted this consultant role, which we're hoping will be successful. There's also been uncertainty about how to define our role. So should we be subsumed under the DEI office or the Rockway Institute potentially? And we're still talking about this and whether to include students. So this is ongoing. And then lastly, I'll mention lack of capacity. So this is volunteer for all of us. It's uncompensated labor, and that explains why we're not able to meet more often than monthly. And we could probably get a lot more accomplished if we could meet more often. So I definitely recommend advocating for workload credit if you want to work this into your institution. So I again want to acknowledge our wonderful work group members of Dr. Estrada, Patton, Conover, Lowy, Gutierrez, and Magalhaes. And lastly, I have some resources here. So the Consortium of Higher Education for LGBT resource professionals is about envisioning education environments where LGBTQ people, inclusive of all of their identities, are fully liberated. So that's a useful resource. I include the Campus Pride Index here, as well as APAG's guidelines. And then I don't have access to a link for the DAM guide, but I am happy to share that if anyone's interested. So wow, I think it's exactly 6:40. Okay, so that is the end of my talk. So I'm happy to take questions. Any questions?
I have one question, and thanks for being an ally. My question is there anything that students can do, since we are, stakeholders, to advocate for a budget to be set aside because of the urgency in the community? I mean, like, I'm working at a resource center, and the pandemic just really kind of escalated everything. So luckily, I did have some good professors. Thank you, Dr. M. And I started a group specific to the high-risk population, which was the African-American sexual gender minorities, and was able to get funding for it. But I felt that if I did not have individual interactions with the faculty that I had, I would not have been prepared to respond to the crisis if I would have just counted on what was not available, outside of those individual conversations. So just thinking in a way of being more proactive. Is there something that students can do to advocate that a specific budget be set aside so we can literally take action? I mean, my goodness, the APA has already publicly apologized. It's been a lot of things done wrong. So I'm just wondering, would that help?
Yeah, great question, because certainly we need resources, and especially if we're going to be recruiting people to help move these systems along, we need to properly compensate people. And this is something we've talked a lot about with our new director, Mohammed Ahmed, and he is very much on board with getting DEI funding and resources. And so our group has been advocating for allocating some of those resources to certain areas, for example, funding a consultant role to help, increase Alliance awareness and competence around transgender and gender expansive individuals. So I would say, as students, it's I think you have more weight and maybe power behind your voice if you are a member of like a work group or have some sort of name behind you. I think sometimes the institution just responds better to that. And so there is that new transgender and gender expansive student work group across Alliant campuses that you could become a part of, or you could even just send a request to the work group. Like, I really think it's important we get funding and advocate for XYZ. And then I think the work group, again, has this name behind them that they can push it forward. So that's my initial thought, but really important question.
Okay, one more thing regarding that. So is it more so the name, or is it more so a matter of numbers?
Yeah, good question. My instinct is to say it's a little bit of both. I think just saying, like, we have this work group, at least for us in our faculty work group, it has helped us that the provosts are referencing it and responding to it. But I also think numbers can help. What I think could be really helpful is if there were an actual climate survey that was, released, and then the students can provide feedback in that way, or town halls. So, for example, in our San Diego campus, there's a student of color group, and they advocated for a town hall where they could voice their concerns and needs to leadership. And so leadership held a town hall. Actually, I wonder if that was across campuses. I'm not sure. And I think in those settings, again, because the intent is for these change to happen, I think sometimes leadership is a little more responsive.
Thank you.
Other questions? I don't know if Michael or Cristina, you want to chime in either, because you're both members of the group.
Well, I think you did a great job talking about, summarizing what the group has done so far it's a good example of how faculty can mobilize to advocate for our students. So I wouldn't add anything to that. Just maybe a thought, a comment that this is hard work. It's not easy. We're all so busy, already consumed by the activities of every day. And being an ally means, doing this unpaid work, extra step. But it's meaningful work, and it's important for our students, and it's important for us to feel useful, to feel like we are doing something that nobody else is addressing. So I think this is worth our time, worth our effort, even though it's one extra step.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's incredibly rewarding to see the results. So now we have this clear name change in process. And I think, it can be a lot of effort, but it's a lot of reward as well. Any other questions or comments?
Maybe wondering if you could expand a little bit on what has been accomplished so far from the students' end. I know that students want to be involved as well, and a decision was made not to include students at this point in this particular task force, but conversations happened, and there's a possibility that another group that has formed might eventually merge with this one, or how are the students getting involved in, and I don't know if you know what they're doing at this point to advocate as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't actually know what they're doing at this point. I know that they started by reviewing some of the program handbooks and starting to identify areas where language needs to be changed, which they want to translate across campuses, which is great. And I am not sure what their other action steps are right now. I know that a lot of students ended up joining, which was great. So I had reached out to several students, and some of them might even be on this call, had joined the group. So I think they were bigger than they expected, which was great.
I'm always thinking about, free social labor. Because there is an exchange. Students want the experience and an opportunity to contribute to change. And I'm wondering if there was a way to kind of set up a kind of like an internship opportunity where this could just be, and that way you wouldn't have to maximize too much of faculty time. They just have to like check in. But a lot of this behind the scene work can be done by students, other than just, looking at the handbooks and stuff is great. That's a start, and we know process is slow, but given the fact that everybody's time is kind of, pressed, and you have students that's actually really eager to take advantage of that, maybe figuring out a way where they can get some internship or practicum credit to kind of compensate, the time piece. I don't know, just thinking.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great idea. I think if there was a way to set up you could actually get credit, and even maybe through the Rockway Institute, and we're going to keep talking, I think, about that collaboration, but potentially getting credit through there. We also had brainstormed the idea of recruiting a couple of federal work studies students to work with us, and that it could be more of like a mentorship role where they're I don't know if I use the term internship, but it's similarly like learning through this process of advocacy. So that's something we've discussed in the past that perhaps we will do moving forward. And I know, Stephanie, you were asking about how students can get involved if these groups don't exist. And so certainly it is more of a challenge when these groups don't exist. I think that if you can identify faculty members who are doing some of this work, perhaps the research, teaching course-related content, and connecting with them, you could even start to establish a small group of just two of you. But I think identifying faculty who are doing this work at your institution could be helpful. We've also seen students from the ground up really, writing their own letters to leadership or requesting and organizing their own trainings or programs with community members. So that's a possibility.
I also, want to recognize that although a lot of this work is unpaid work, many of us who have been doing this work for many years have been compensated in different ways. And one of the compensations that we all get from doing this work, aside from, the joy of participating in advocacy, is that actually it does help with professional development and career development. It is true that maybe it doesn't assist everyone depending on their career path. But for faculty, for example, we get to put on our evaluations every year of the kinds of things we do for service to the profession, for service to the Alliant community. I mean, we don't get paid for it, but we do get the recognition that we're going that extra mile, and that can help with promotion. It can help to demonstrate to a new employer that we have leadership skills. So I just want to put it out there that even for students, that might not be an immediate reward from doing the work, that we all get some reward, whether in the form of personal pleasure for being involved in the work, but it does help with developing professional skills that are valued at Alliant, but also outside Alliant, at other places, for getting jobs, especially for students. As you put on your vita that you took on a leadership position in forming a particular group, that's a valued skill as well. It doesn't take away. I don't want to minimize the fact that yes, this is unpaid labor, but I also want to recognize there is other forms of reward from this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that more and more in the community, I think that trans and gender expansive people are advocating to be compensated for their labor. And so I wanted to acknowledge that some faculty or students might want to join, but don't have the capacity. And you're absolutely right. And actually, so I help with APA internship coordination. And even for students in that stage, when you're applying to your internships, if you're going to a clinical internship, it can be great to have this on your CV, to have this experience, and sites might be really grateful to welcome you with that level of experience and advocacy. So thanks for pointing that out. Okay, well, I know we're going into the break, so feel free to take a break if you need one. I can also stick around if there are any other questions.
Okay, for those who may have questions after the break or during the break, you can stay and ask questions. So we can return at 7 p.m. our time and 12 p.m. Aussie time. Hopefully I'm getting the times correct here.
Thank you.
We've arrived at our last presentation for today. So for our next presentation, we have Dr. David Paul. So he is the system-wide director and assistant professor in the clinical counseling master's program at Alliant. Dr. Paul has a PhD in counselor education and supervision with a specialization in marriage and family therapy. Dr. Paul has over 30 years of administrative, supervision, research, counseling, and teaching experience in higher education and community settings. Next, we also have Dr. Jeremy Bolton. He is a visiting assistant professor in the clinical psychology PhD program at Alliant. Dr. Bolton holds a PhD in clinical psychology from California School of Professional Psychology and has been certified in LGBT human services and mental health through the Rockway Institute. And we also have David Ruiz. He is a recent graduate of the clinical counseling master's program at Alliant. He attended Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York, where he majored in neuroscience and behavior. He participated in research on how fear, conditioning, and MSO affect brain structures and behavior. He has been accepted into the PsyD Clinical Psychology program at Pepperdine University, California. And lastly, for our group of presenters is me, which you already know a bit about. This is my first research project, but not my last, as I've been accepted into the PhD program at Alliant. And Dr. Paul and David, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Zane, for that introduction. David, if you can share your screen and get our presentation playing, that would be great.
Okay, I can do that.
Thank you.
Okay.
We're very happy to share with you our current research project. Our overarching research question for our study is, what has been the experience of being both transgendered and undocumented been like for you and your family? Since the very beginning of my employment at the Fresno campus in the California School of Professional Psychology at Alliant International University, I became aware of a group of individuals who were meeting on our campus every month. And this group, a support group, was led by a local organization that I later found out was called Trans Emotion. This was a group of transgender individuals who were meeting monthly for a support group. And I had some initial curiosity. I had some clients who were transgendered, and I was wondering about the experience of this group. I was also a new resident to Florida and to the central San Joaquin Valley region here in California. Since then, I also became aware of a group in Fresno County and really throughout the state called Out for Mental Health. And between these two groups, Trans Emotion and Out for Mental Health organization, they both strive as part of their mission to serve the mental health needs of transgender individuals, as well as other issues that this population experiences. So in terms of our statement of problem, it's pretty easy to understand how someone's sense of belonging can be really central in their formation of identity in terms of group allegiance or national origin. And of course, it's also pretty easy to understand how one's sexuality greatly affects our individual identity development. But part of our question is, what happens when both our national origin or our sense of country, as well as our developing sexuality, what happens when those identities become conflicted? There does seem to be a pretty clear gap in the literature when we transition this group of being both undocumented and transgendered. And of course, it's pretty easy to understand how members of both of those groups, again, being undocumented and being transitioning your gender, would be reluctant in approaching mental health services. Additionally, in terms of a statement of problem for our research study, we're hoping that this will help inform some of the multicultural competency issues, both in the training and education of counselors, as well as the ongoing continuing education needs of therapists. And we thought this would fit really well into the theme for this conference, because we imagine that we'll be finding some social justice and advocacy concerns related to this group, and of course, some possible counseling interventions and strategies. So one of the purposes and significance of our study, there does seem to be, the discourse is rather prevalent regarding LGBTQI and undocumented immigrants. There does seem to be a a fair amount of research in the peer review literature, but where the gap appears really is when we intersect those two groups, when we consider the experience of someone who is both an undocumented immigrant as well as being transgender. And one of the purposes of where we feel as clinical counselors, it's vitally important for us to study this population, is we can imagine, based on the existing literature, that a certain level of sensitivity is needed to really account for and represent the experience of this group. But there does seem to be a very clear lack of peer review research dedicated to the experience of people who are both undocumented or identify as transgender. So the gap is pretty clear. One of the things that we found, and we're going to go over in more detail in our review of literature, looking at the existing peer review literature, the three factors that seem to be loud and clear as risk factors are legal invalidation, as well as elevated risk for depression and anxiety, and just this general gap of knowledge for healthcare practitioners and mental health providers about how to provide care for this group. Legal invalidation is really experienced twofold. Firstly, the United States immigration process and its lack of transparency when denying claims for entry when all proper documents have been submitted and fees paid. The second legal invalidation occurs when transgender individual fails to be recognized in legal documents and they're forced to use their birth name. The second risk factor pertains to this elevated risk of depression and anxiety for this group. Transgender undocumented immigrants are susceptible to multiple stressors. These stressors include, but are certainly not limited to, verbal, physical, sexual assault, a need to hide their undocumented status, and an ongoing fear for their safety and security. These risk factors can increase the probability to experience a health consequence such as depression or anxiety. And then finally, due to their elevated risk for depression, the third risk factor found in the literature is the gap in knowledge for healthcare practitioners and mental health providers regarding undocumented and transgender individuals. The literature calls for health practitioners to close the gap in their knowledge in order to better serve this population. By better understanding these risk factors undocumented and transgender individuals face, healthcare practitioners can better understand potential causes and increased treatment options for this group. So it is important for therapists to understand the circumstances surrounding the experiences of undocumented and transitioning people. But it is very clear that this intersection between these two groups are missing. And we really feel, based here in the San Joaquin Valley region, that we are uniquely situated to examine this group. There is an estimated 82,000 undocumented immigrants living here in the Central Valley region alone. One of the challenges was finding the right methodology. So in examining the three themes when we did our review of literature, we believe that qualitative approach, specifically narrative inquiry, will allow us to really get at the issues that this group experiences. And we're using a seldom used analysis called portraiture, which is a method of documenting and analyzing this experience. And we'll go into that next in more detail. The timeline and scope for our research has been very negatively impacted by the COVID-19 health crisis. We had hoped by this time to be able to share some of our data with you, but due to COVID-19, we were really set back a little bit. So we only recently attained IRB approval at our university. We are presenting basically our review of literature here today. We will be conducting interviews now until the end of the year, And hopefully earlier next year, we'll be analyzing the data and hopefully submitting a manuscript. Our overarching research question, again, is what is the experience of being transgendered and undocumented? But here are the 9 questions we plan to ask our research participants. How do you understand your gender identity? Do your immigration status and gender identity affect one another? How does your culture affect your expression and understanding of your gender identity? What are some of the hardships or stressors that you've experienced now or in the past, if any? What conflicts, if any, do you experience between different aspects of your gender, such as immigration status, gender identity, and culture? What are some of the more positive aspects or outcomes of being transgender, gender nonconforming, undocumented, or being from a different culture? Are there people that do not know that you are transgender or undocumented or both? And if you have accessed mental health services, what was the experience like for you? And finally, is there anything else you want me to know about your preferred identity and life experiences? What we hope to find, or what we hope as some intended outcomes, is we hope to develop some recommendations for preferred treatment plans, effective therapy approaches, and counseling techniques, as well as recommendations for social justice advocacy initiatives. We are also, because it's a qualitative study, we're also interested in identifying some of the proactive coping mechanisms and client resiliencies of this population and sample. And of course, we hope to expand the existing peer-reviewed literature. And most importantly, as we believe qualitative research will help us do this, we really want to give voice to this very vulnerable and sometimes hidden population. So now I'm going to turn it over to one of our research assistants, Mr. David Ruiz, who's going to walk us through our methodology. Go ahead, Dave.
Thank you. My name is David, and I'm going to be going over our methodology section for the study. So can you hit the next slide, please? Okay, so we picked a qualitative research design because this design was selected, this design was selected due to its focus on understanding experiences from the perception of research participants, and it considers words from the participants themselves, which paints their stories in a more accurate light rather than reducing their experience by attempting to quantify them. In addition, qualitative research design fits the study perfectly in that it asserts the process of coming to a conclusion based on an assessment of evidence rather than the other way around. Next slide, please. We're going to be using narrative inquiry, and this study design began in the 1960s, which is highly varied and used across the myriad of disciplines like history, anthropology, psychology, sociology, communications, and cultural studies. And it focuses on one's choice of language and words in relationship with other people. And another focus is human interaction in relationships. And this interaction is exactly what we want to explore in our study. Narrative analysis is also an analysis of an individual's life story. And narrative inquiry emphasizes facets of a life story, like how some elements are sequenced, why some elements are evaluated differently, and how past experiences affect the views on the present. And the purpose of it is to try and understand the complexities of an experience by deconstructing it into separate and remembered parts, or restoring it and reordering and transforming the research participants' own words. Next slide, please. So as mentioned by Dr. Paul, the main question driving our study is what has been the experience of being both transgendered and undocumented for you and your family. And narrative inquiry gives us the flexibility to not only ask questions that are planned and designed, but also be able to ask follow-up questions that will provide additional data concerning the experience of participants. Data gathered in the study is framed by the participants' personal experiences and cultural historical contexts, and this data will also be processed through recorded interviews and then processed into text. And the outcome text is also going to be analyzed, and the purpose of this analysis is to develop a framework for a common sequence of events and themes, and this will serve the purpose of creating almost a portrait of what the transgender undocumented experience is like, where we will be able to spot common dimensions that affect each individual in similar ways. Next slide, please. In other words, key elements and themes will be extrapolated from the data, And we will also be using an analysis technique called portraiture to frame interview questions, documentation, analysis, and narrative development. Portraiture uses ethnography, or the study of people in their own environment, and artistic aesthetic values to minimize pathology and increase positive experiences. Portraiture relies on inductive rather than deductive analysis, or the generation of theories rather than the testing of theories. And context is also vital in portraiture, as it's vital when painting a portrait of some kind. The background is considered, and the background in the instance of our study is going to take the form of gaining knowledge on the research topic beforehand and paying attention to the environment that the participant inhabits. And we hope that by using portraiture and narrative inquiry, that the results of this study will highlight the need for more meaningful counseling approaches and interventions for use with this population. Next slide, please. Okay. So participants and sampling. So our inclusion criteria are going to be individuals over the age of 18 who can provide consent, and individuals who self-identify as transgender and have been undocumented in the past or are currently undocumented, and the minimum of 7 to 10 participants will be met. The reason why we're looking at individuals who have been undocumented in the past is that we still believe it's a meaningful experience and worthy of exploration for our study. And we will also be using purposive network sampling, which allows for the selection of information-rich study participants. And it further lends credibility to the study and minimizes constraints or availability of time and resources. Furthermore, in qualitative inquiry, only a small sample size of research participants is needed, about 5 to 15, to obtain a representative sample. And this smaller sample size allows us to focus more attention on the interview content and the interview process itself. After getting approval from Alliant RB, which we already have, as mentioned by Dr. Paul, we will begin to actively recruit participants via networking and snowballing. And a letter will also be strategically posted on social media websites and the local communities. Next slide, please. So this letter will contain an email address and telephone number, which interested participants could use to contact the principal investigator for more information. And there will be a screening process over the phone, which will be using a telephone script. And in this phone call, the informed consent and research procedures will be explained. In addition, the process for data collection and recording of the participants' information will be standardized using a data and demographic form, and consenting individuals will be assigned consecutive numbers starting at 1 on a data and demographic form to protect their confidentiality. Next slide, please. Thank you. Procedures and data collection. So participants will be provided a verbal description of the questions asked, and they will also be offered a $50 gift card as an incentive to participate in our study, and they will be given that $50 gift card when they're done with the interview. And if they are interested in participating, the researchers will schedule an appointment to discuss informed consent and the nature of the study. And we will be giving them opportunities to ask questions and to review and sign the informed consent form and the data and demographic form prior to the interviews commencing. And once this consent form is signed, the participants will be asked to answer the interview questions voluntarily and honestly to the best of their ability. And these interviews should take about 90 minutes. And during these audio recorded interviews, follow-up questions will be asked as mentioned before. Next slide, please. Thank you. So trustworthiness and credible results. To encourage trustworthiness and rigor, bracketing and member checking will be used. And bracketing is a method that researchers use to help suspend or bracket their assumptions and preconceptions. And some bracketing techniques include reflexive journaling and following the cues and areas of interest brought up by the research participants during the semi-structured interview. And member checking is a process that ensures that research participants' experiences have been accurately translated in data by minimizing the potential for misinterpretation by the researchers. And this will be done by emailing the draft scripts to the participants, and the participants' feedback will then be used for verification of the written script. It's essential to acknowledge and bracket any potential biases that might exist during the interviews and the analysis of the interviews. And we'll be keeping written field notes before and after each interview. And these field notes will also be kept throughout the study process in order to track and record the thoughts, feelings, questions, or concerns that surface. And as a means of further reducing bias, the participant interviews will be audio recorded into written scripts as mentioned before. Next slide, please. So the data analysis. So after the interviews are conducted, each audio recording will be independently transcribed, and the recordings will be listened to again and compared to the written transcripts for accuracy, and then the transcripts will be read in their entirety. Furthermore, we're going to be using a holistic content approach to focus on the content of the complete story of each participant, meaning we're going to analyze the meaning of each question answered within the context of the whole story. And we will also connect each particular section with other parts of the participant's narrative. And we will also conduct a content analysis on the outcome text across the interviews. And this content analysis will continue until saturation is reached. And this content analysis will be done to identify a framework of common timeline events and themes. After the saturation of themes and time sequences occurs, we will come to a consensus on the interpretation and the supporting quotes. And for each identified theme, we will extract relevant summaries and quotes from each interview, and the summaries from each interview will then be compiled and examined as a whole. And we will include an interpretation of significant similarities and differences in the stories of the participants and include them in a discussion of our outcomes. Next slide, please. So some risks and limitations. So it was determined that some of the interview questions and answers could invoke unpleasant feelings and memories for some of the research participants. However, this discomfort will be addressed by letting the participants know that they can stop the interview at any time should they choose to, and they will be made aware that there will be no major consequences for stopping the interview. And if these uncomfortable feelings persist, we will refer the participant to available community resources, including counseling and emergency services as needed or requested. Another possible risk is protecting their confidentiality, which will be achieved by following some guidelines, such as limiting the access of information gathered to just our research team. And to protect identifying information, each participant will be assigned an ID number, which will be used for subsequent records. And each participant's assigned ID number, name, and telephone number will be kept in a separate locked file cabinet for the purpose of facilitating the follow-up process. Another possible limitation is that the study is targeting individuals in the Central Valley region, specifically in the Fresno County region. So future studies that may want to expand to other areas. However, we're choosing to narrow our focus in that we believe that we may find results unique to our area. And now Lisette is going to talk about some review of literature. Thank you.
Hello, as David mentioned, I'll be going over the first half of our review of literature. Next slide, please. One of the things literature we reviewed repeated across many studies was the separation of immigrant issues and LGBTQ+ issues that exists in the studies that they themselves reviewed. Their aim was to bridge the gap and intersect those identities, much like our aim is to bridge the gap between transgender and undocumented. One thing that may become clear in our literature review is how big that gap is for those identities, mostly by the lack of articles we share on those intersecting identities. To start, I will be discussing what we found specific to LGBTQ+ identities. Next slide. In their study, Nakamura and Pope noted how much immigrants rely on their communities when they are in an unfamiliar environment. But then that raises the question, where might that leave LGBTQ+ immigrants? Well, it often leaves them alone and isolated in a new environment. There were 3 suggestions made by Nakamura and Pope for mental health practitioners to keep in mind with this population. The first is to not assume heterosexuality with an immigrant client. Even when they've mentioned a partner of the opposite gender, there's a B and there's a plus in LGBTQ+ for a reason. Secondly, we're not to assume an LGBTQ+ client is a citizen. These identities intersect, and unless an inclusive space is created by mental health practitioners, an immigrant or an LGBTQ+ client will not feel safe enough to disclose all their identities, which may be relevant to their presenting problems. For Lewis and Naples, they noted that little integration has happened between LGBTQ+ and immigration, and the main connecting theme in their article and the rest of the literature on this topic is the examination of the structures of oppression that characterize the experiences of LGBTQ+ in the asylum process, and that system's regulation of queer expression. Queer expression in this system means that they must fit into the stereotypes. A gay man must fit into the stereotype of being feminine, or a lesbian must be a stone cold butch. We'll touch a little later on the asylum process. Next slide. In the case of this population and the symptoms they may experience as they acclimate to the US, Rhodes and others share their findings. They estimated the prevalence of depressive symptoms among immigrant Latino sexual minorities. This population is also at an elevated risk for mental health disparities and stress related to discrimination, which may also lead to depression, psychological distress, and psychiatric disorders. On the topic of discrimination, Rhodes and others found lower estimates of perceived discrimination amongst recently arrived immigrant Latinos over those that have acclimated to the new country. Rhodes and others gave 3 reasons for this. The first one was that they may not recognize the discrimination they are experiencing. The other, they may be satisfied with the work they find here. And lastly, they may evaluate their US experiences as not as bad as what brought them to the United States. The topic of discrimination continues in Morales and others' research article. In this article, they found Latino men in the study were much more highly aware of the discrimination they faced or would face if they presented themselves as more feminine. The men in the study saw the need to hide that part and appear like the stereotypical tough man. Not fully machismo, but definitely no giveaways to their sexual identity. Apart from discrimination and the reasons for immigrating, Morales and others found an important theme in their study that social justice advocating mental health practitioners should keep in mind. And that is this group's access to healthcare. The healthcare topic is a mess, and I'll leave it at that, with the addition that it's an even bigger mess and an injustice if a person is undocumented. But immigrants are a resilient group. The participants in the study shared they are proactive in preventing illnesses, from making the caldo that their abuela fed them in their home country to taking their vitamins and drinking orange juice every day. If your client is an undocumented immigrant or you work with this population, don't forget the topic of healthcare. But healthcare is not the only thing social justice advocating mental health practitioners should keep in mind. If an immigrant client does not have proper documentation, they may face additional challenges like accessing public assistance, housing, employment, which that alone leads to additional exploitation, and also difficulty finding social support systems. Next slide. We arrive at the population driving our study, transgender immigrants. In the study conducted by Goen and others, they highlighted stressors experienced by Mexican trans female immigrants. This population, the stressors they experienced were verbal and physical abuse, sexual assaults, unstable environments, fear for their safety and security, the need to hide their undocumented status, and lastly, economic insecurity. The study found that a number of health consequences emerged from those stressors, consequences that they named as PTSD, depression, anxiety, trouble sleeping, isolation, substance abuse, and suicidal tendencies. Now, we know that access to healthcare is a barrier for undocumented immigrants. And looking at the stressors identified by Goen and others' study, some of them could be helped if this population could access public assistance. In his article, Morales points out that without proper documentation, like the legal documents, they will face challenges, as we've already mentioned, accessing healthcare, accessing housing, accessing food stamps, credible employment, and social support, all of which are pertinent to their well-being. All of the articles mentioned in this first half of our literature review make some comment on the oppression found in the asylum process. Dr. Bolton will be elaborating on the articles we found that more directly explain the injustices in that system. Next slide.
Thank you, Lizette. So yeah, we're going to see a lot of the themes repeated that we saw in some of the earlier articles. And Murray, for instance, investigated the experiences of LGBT refugees in Canada and found that they were being impacted by false applicants. So there were applicants there who were posing as LGBTQ plus asylum seekers, but who didn't actually identify in that way. And these false applicants played into the fears of the conservative forces in Canadian society and helped to put more barriers and helped to empower more negative legislation that impacted the legitimate asylum seekers. They also created additional stress in other ways. For instance, LGBT refugee support groups were flooded suddenly with people who did not actually identify as LGBTQ+, and some of the participants in the support groups, for instance, would see people who said they were gay interacting with gay males, for instance, romantically with some of the females there, or hitting on some of the lesbian females there, which was distressing in its own sense, of course. Basically, the immigrants are put into a situation too as part of the asylum seeking process, where they have to, they go from a situation in their home country where they may have to hide their sexual and gender identity in their country of origin for safety purposes. But then when they get here, they're forced to try to prove it to government officials. And so this can be a very difficult transition for them. And next slide, please. So Forbear worked for an organization that prepared LGBTQ plus asylum seekers for their hearings in Canada. And she emphasizes the power of stories, and that as a part of the immigration process, asylum seekers have to become active storytellers because they have to make the case for themselves. They have to, in a sense, prove their LGBTQ plus identities. And often this means that they have to do it by meeting ethnocentric expectations of the officials that they're trying to convince, right? So some in her experiences and in her qualitative study, some of the participants found this process of telling their story to be empowering, but others found that they felt this sense of needing to conform to what they thought the officials were expecting. And unfortunately, this leaves the asylum seekers at the mercy of the officials and the biases of the officials. So for instance, often the officials have no sense of the fact that sexuality and gender are very culturally and socially and locations specific. So they may be expecting Western Canadian ideas of these gender identities and sexual orientations, and expecting immigrants from a vast variety of cultures and nations to conform to those, which isn't always the case. Also, a lot of those seeking asylum have a great deal of internalized homo negativity, for instance. And it may be very difficult for them to talk about any of their experiences. And claimants had been denied for things such as not looking gay enough, not looking trans enough, not having a same-sex relationship, or just because they were uncomfortable talking about their sexuality. If you think about it, in many cultures, that's not something you talk about with other people easily. Next slide, please. All right, so Forbear also worked with couples seeking asylum. And in many countries of origin, relationships increase visibility and therefore risk. So many of the asylum seekers went to great lengths to hide their relationships in their countries of origin. For instance, even going so far as to having cover relationships with the opposite sex, which didn't align with their sexual orientation. And this makes the difficulty of convincing the immigration officials of their actual relationship that much more difficult, because they have to try to produce evidence of a relationship. But if they came from a country where they were hiding their relationship from friends, family, from the public, and from officials, they often don't have any documentation, any witnesses, or even any photographs necessarily to show that they actually are in a relationship with their partner. Next slide, please. So if we look at White, he examines strategies related to queer immigrant justice in the context of nation states. She found that advocates faced a tension between working within the system and advocating for change. And again, we've got this theme of conformity, of LGBTQ plus immigrants having to conform to heteronormative neoliberal sociocultural norms in order to gain acceptance and refuge. And applicants are often evaluated in terms of deserving and undeserving, with those fitting the neoliberal expectations of being exceptional as being the ones that are favored and allowed entry and allowed asylum. And there's a reinforcing of these heteronormative expectations as part of this process we're seeing here again. And in the US, even positive things or relatively positive things like the DREAM Act perpetuate this by reproducing these dominant ideas of productive versus non-productive immigrants, right? And so this leaves out a lot of folks who are marginalized or struggling. Next, please. So when it comes to LGBTQ plus mental health services, right, undocumented and marginalized immigrants may be very wary of clinicians and see us as representatives of a hostile and oppressive system. And this is true for LGBT individuals as well. So if we're dealing with undocumented trans individuals, for instance, they have twice as much reason to be suspicious of us. We need to be mindful of our position in the power differential in these contexts. And we had some recent issues here in the US with therapists and therapy notes being used against immigrants. So unaccompanied minors had been required to attend therapy here in the US, but the current administration used the therapy notes against undocumented immigrants in court. And this has been part of a wider effort to discourage immigration in general, and asylum applications in particular by our current administration. Next, please. All right, and in terms of our methodology, right, intersectionality is a term coined by Black feminist and critical race scholar Crenshaw. She developed the concept of intersectionality in an attempt to acknowledge the individual aspects of identity, such as race and gender, recognizing that the individual aspects taken in isolation don't allow for a full understanding of oppression. Right? So the experiences of somebody who is female is not the same as somebody who is Black and female, and that's really where she started with her theories and articles on intersectionality, looking at workplace discrimination. But this allows us to look at people in a way where we can recognize individual difference rather than seeing members of groups in a more monolithic sort of way. So it helps us to see the individual experiences easier. And of course, qualitative research, as we spoke about earlier, provides an opportunity to learn from those who are being studied. And this is especially important with marginalized groups, right? We want them to feel that they're heard, that they're participating, and that what they say matters. And being a good listener is fundamental to this form of research. Next, please. All right, and so finally, just to wrap up quickly, because it looks like we're running out of time here, some recommendations for treatment. When working with transgender and gender nonconforming individuals, we want to broaden our understanding of gender. So we want to question ourselves and think about how we think about gender. Do we think about it in very rigid sort of binary sorts of ways, only male and female? That could be a problem for us with transgender individuals. Not everybody identifies in a binary way when it comes to gender. We also want to be knowledgeable about terms and differences between gender identity and sexual orientation. Often people confuse gender identity, sexual orientation, and gender presentation, right? And those are actually three distinct sorts of issues that we need to be able to understand and explain to our clients. We also want to take an intersectional perspective, as this again allows us to see people in their individual contexts more clearly. And we should examine and be aware of our own sexual and gender identities. It's very important if we're going to work with transgender individuals to be comfortable looking at those aspects of ourselves. If we haven't looked at our own gender identity, even if we identify as cisgender, for example, we may have some serious blind spots that can hinder our work. We also want to be aware of and ready to refer to people to other social services. Oftentimes, especially if somebody is undocumented as well, but often trans individuals need extra services, need help, they need support because they often don't get it in the ways that other people do. We should also ensure that our work setting is welcoming, and that means making the environment welcoming in terms of what we display, what's shown when they come into waiting rooms, for instance, making sure our staff knows if we are working with the staff, they know how to interact with trans individuals, that they know about preferred pronouns, and that we make sure our paperwork is trans inclusive. So it has space for more than just male or female checkboxes, for instance, under gender. And we also want to try to use a strength-based approach with these clients. And remember that support groups can be critical. This is an area that trans individuals benefit from greatly, using the community and the resilience in the community to help one another and harnessing that. Thank you.
So our presentation consisted of a pre-recorded presentation on our research design and development. We are currently in the data collection phase. We have been seriously hampered by the COVID-19 virus here in Fresno County. We've only recently been able to go to places and provide information and flyers. Previous to this, we have been trying to recruit research participants by way of social media. And it's kind of come to our attention that our population and sample that we're looking at may not have as much access to social media as we thought. But with all of that said, I would be happy, as well as Zane and David, who are here today, if you have any questions or need any additional information about our study, we certainly would appreciate if you are able and willing to refer potential research participants to our study. Are there any questions?
Yeah, Dr. Paul, I just have a quick question. I know in the presentation you mentioned the hesitancy of this population working with mental health practitioners. So in finding research participants, how are you guys going to go about mitigating that hesitancy for undocumented people to want to speak with you? Because I could imagine that there would be fear of ramifications for coming forward as undocumented, or they would fear that there would be those ramifications.
Right. Well, we have a screening procedure in place, and the screening procedure can consist of a telephone conversation or a Zoom meeting. We also have accessible office space available to us on our campus, as well as in the community. We are supported by two of our local organizations that are willing to make their space available. You may have missed it, but at the top of the presentation, our initial curiosity came from the fact that this group was already using our campus for a monthly support group. So we made the assumption that they were comfortable to come to campus. They may be comfortable to come back for individual meetings. And of course, we also have the ability to see them via Zoom or by an audio recorded telephone conversation. Although it would be preferable if we could experience or be with the research participant for field note collection. And yes, I will make our flyer available. I will send that on to Zay and the other symposium organizers. Yes, I will send that to everyone. Are there any other questions about our research study, our choice of methodology, our review of literature, and what we hope to find in our study? I will say this, this is perhaps a little pat on the shoulder to our university. We are the California School of Professional Psychology, which is part of Alliant International University. The university has been very supportive of this research project. It has been funded. It has been encouraged, and we've even recently been nominated for an award, which we're really pleased to even be considered for. The only thing our study is really lacking at this point are more research participants.
All right, so if we, do we have any more questions or comments that we'd like to ask Dr. Paul?
I got a quick question. I was thinking about that the $50 card. I don't know how it goes. I know a lot of the folks that I get to interact with would like prefer a night hotel stay, so they can be off the street at night. I don't know if it's something that could be worked out. I know you already did the IRB process, so that may be a hassle, but
actually, we've made it, I'm very glad that you asked about that, because we've made it as seamless as possible. We are able to electronically transfer a gift card of the research participant's choice. We can also have the option to mail a gift card of the research participant's choice. So it can be done through an electronic credit card or a credit card of again, the research participant's choice sent directly to them.
Okay, is that information on the flyer? I just want to know how hard I got to work to make the sales pitch. Is everything I need on that flyer, or am I going to have to add a commercial to it?
Well, you know, we'll revisit the flyer in view of your question, but we do make it clear that a gift card is made available to research participants. It's not a set gift card. It's something that we wanted to be able to provide something unique for each research participant.
Thank you.
I'd be happy to send you the flyer, and if you want to recommend any type of
I'll put my email up here. Yeah, I mean, I'm hanging out, so you know, anything that'll get them, you know, a moment of reprieve, I'm all for it. And I'm always like talking to them about participating in research. The thing is, they don't trust us, and they have a lot of reason not to. But you know, money talks before research findings do. You know, so
yes,
I'm just gonna add mine. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm very glad to hear your comment, and I appreciate that.
So any other comments or questions?
Maybe I do have one question, just more curious, because I'm an immigrant myself. I was wondering if there was a strategic decision about specifically studying the situation for undocumented immigrants, and what the rationale was. You know, of course, researchers have the opportunity to refine their research questions, and just wondering what was the thinking behind focusing the study specifically on undocumented immigrants or immigrants more broadly.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, because we made a distinction that they could currently be undocumented or had been undocumented in the past. Because a lot of what we are asking the research participants is to share with us their experience of being both undocumented and transitioning. I think the idea was those two themes, you know, who am I in terms of my sexual identity, and where am I as far as my my cultural heritage or my choice of country, what happens to you as an individual when both of those things are in a transition, when they're in flux, when you're not comfortable being in one or the other, or you're not comfortable where you are and you're moving towards the preferred either gender expression or country of choice for you to reside in. Is there something about that experience that is unique? Because that was the big gap that we found in the literature. There were hardly any studies that really examined that intersection. And we're very aware of the population that we have here in the Central Valley region. I keep referring to the Central Valley region. Maybe people aren't aware of this. We are a largely agricultural center. In fact, 40% of the US food comes from California's Central Valley region. So at any given time, there are a lot of immigrants here who do not have legal status. And what happens when when that population has members that are also transitioning their sexual identity, their sexual expression. It's a unique population that we have access to, and they are part of our community, and they are sorely lacking in coming forward to get mental health services or just health care services in general. And so we really want to be able to learn more about them and to be able to advocate and help educate practitioners on what would be some good ideas for treatment planning, as well as the choice of techniques for counseling and therapy. I hope I tried to address some of your question, Cristina.
I was just curious about the distinction between documented versus undocumented. Sounds like one of the things that your group is looking for is understand the experience of transitioning or changing, yes, both in gender and in culture.
Yes.
But all immigrants experience that. All trans immigrants would experience that, whether they are documented or undocumented. So I was wondering if there was any particular reason why your group is focusing on the experience of undocumented immigrants, but it might be, based on what you're saying, that it might have something to do with the community that you are working with, which happens to be undocumented.
Right. Yeah, one of the statistics we found is somewhere around 82,000, which is an estimate of our residents are undocumented. There was a reference to it in our presentation, which was prior to our last federal election. This was during an era where undocumented immigrants were being targeted and were further being victimized by our own government. Gladfully and hopefully things have changed now, but we're still very interested in that population. But you've given me something to think about, and I think we're going to discuss this at our next research team meeting, because we did allow that in our IRB, that we could interview people who had previously been undocumented and now have established some form of residency. So we might be able to communicate that better, and it might just help us in finding additional research participants. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that.
Any more questions? Okay, I guess if this is all the questions, then I would, before I close, before the end, I'd like to thank all the people that are here today. Thank you for your time, for coming and supporting this symposium. I also like to give special thanks to those who helped make this event possible, especially for the gracious support. First of all, I'd like to thank the speakers, Tiki Inacay, Dr. Cristina Magalhaes, Dr. Jennifer Staples, Dr. David Paul, Dr. Jeremy Bolton, David Ruiz, and Zane Sandoval. I'd like to also send a great appreciation to Stephanie Cunningham and Rose Wake for working with me putting this symposium together, and also to the staff of Box Hill Institute for supporting this vision. I also like to thank those who are behind the scenes, Adam Anderson, Joey Ramirez, Leanne Priaco, Stephanie Mata, my cohort members, and anyone I may have missed who helped behind the scenes. You know. So Stephanie, I was going back to kind of, before we close, just discussing a little bit of our experiences on how we kind of came onto this journey here. Go ahead, Steph.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic definitely altered the trajectory of this working collaboration between Box Hill and Alliant. When we were originally discussing doing student immersion programs and sending staff and students to the States and you guys over to Australia. But COVID definitely put a spanner in the works, as it's a common phrase here in Australia. But I think collaboratively, we, ran with it, took that challenge, and have created something really wonderful to really start this conversation, not just within our own countries that we're currently residing in, but internationally, and being able to share ideas with one another. That was, I mean, we've all talked about how important that is for us to share ideas and knowledge.
Yeah, it's been a tough process. Like I said, COVID hit and we had to make plans, change plans, and ideas started kind of wondering what we should do. And the symposium was probably the next best step, since we couldn't travel, and then also changing the certain dates to meet certain opportunities. And I think putting together in the past 4 or 5 months, putting the symposium together was really, I think we worked really hard. So, but just putting this together, I think, helped us get a better understanding of, how we can get past the barriers that we ran into this past year. So it allowed us to expand our thinking outside the box.
Exactly. And for those who aren't aware, the reason why we've timed this symposium on the dates that we've chosen is it aligns with the end of Pride Month. And it also is leading up to NAIDOC Week here in Australia. So we felt that it was very appropriate with Alliant's topic today being on LGBTQIA plus communities, and Box Hill's topic tomorrow on appreciating Indigenous cultures, that we put this symposium right in between those two very big events, just to even more continue the conversation.
Yes, and that's what we want to do, is continue the conversation. And that's the important thing, is that we want to create the safe space for those who need it. So it's getting to that time. So I'm going to say my last few words. Just a reminder, tomorrow's event, day 2, will be the Australian group, which is about the Indigenous people. Sorry if I don't get it correctly, but also as well, thank you for your time. And that is the end of our symposium for today. And we'll see you tomorrow, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.